On a morning in September of the year 1695, in the pale haze that rises off the Arabian Sea when the monsoon winds have finally begun to ease, a ship lay waiting in the blue water between worlds. She was called the Fancy, and she was not a large vessel, perhaps 46 guns, perhaps fewer, depending on which account you trust. But she was fast, faster than almost anything else that sailed those waters, her hull scraped clean of barnacles and her upper works cut down to reduce drag, rebuilt by her captain for exactly this kind of work. Her gun ports stood open, her crew crouched silent at their stations, watching the eastern horizon through the shimmer of heat, waiting for sails. The captain was a quiet man, perhaps 35 years old, with the weathered hands of a working seaman and the watchful eyes of someone who had learned in a hard school to read men and situations before they could read him. His name, or one of his names, was Henry Every, though he had sailed under other names before and would use others again. He had been a Royal Navy sailor once, a mate on slave ships after that, and then something worse than either, a mutineer who had seized this very vessel from her sleeping captain and sailed her out of a Spanish harbor in the dead of night into the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across the Indian Ocean to this place, this moment, this hinge point of his existence. He was now a pirate, which meant he was an outlaw in every port on earth, a man with no flag, no nation, and no future except what he could take at the point of a sword. And in a few hours, this quiet, watchful man would commit the single most profitable act of robbery in the entire recorded history of piracy, a crime so staggering in its scale that it would shake the relationship between England and the Mughal Empire, threaten the very survival of the East India Company, and trigger the first worldwide manhunt the world had ever seen. He would become, for a brief blazing moment, the most wanted man on the planet, his name spoken in London coffee houses and Indian palaces and Caribbean taverns and African trading posts, the subject of ballads and plays and fevered speculation in every port where English ships called. And then he would vanish, simply disappear from the pages of history as completely as if he had stepped off the edge of the world into the sea. He was never captured, never tried, never executed. He was never reliably seen or heard from again. The richest pirate in history simply walked off the stage of the world and left behind nothing but questions, rumors, and the fading memory of one impossible morning on the warm, dark waters of the Arabian Sea. This is the story of how that happened, and of why, more than 3 centuries later, we still do not know how it ended. Before we can understand the man, we must understand the world that made him and what we can and cannot know about the shape of his life. The sources for Henry Every's story are frustratingly limited. The earliest and most important account is a small pamphlet published in London just a few years after the events themselves, supposedly based on conversations with a crew member who had been present for everything. It is sensational, unreliable, and in several key particulars almost certainly wrong, but it is also the closest thing we have to a direct witness, and much of what has been written about Every since rests upon its shaky foundation. We have court records from the trials of several of his men who were later captured and executed, and these contain useful fragments of testimony, though filtered through the pressure of the courtroom and the very real threat of the gallows. We have letters and dispatches from East India Company officials who were desperate to distance themselves from the disaster Every had caused, and who had every reason to exaggerate the crime and minimize any English involvement. We have Mughal sources, including chronicles and diplomatic correspondence, which describe the attack from the other side, from the perspective of the victims, and which make clear that what happened aboard the Ganges Sawai was far worse than most English tellings have been willing to acknowledge. And we have legend. Within a few years of his disappearance, Every had become the subject of popular fiction, most famously a fanciful novel called The Life and Adventures of Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe, which imagined him founding a pirate utopia on the island of Madagascar, a wealthy king among thieves. This was nonsense, but it was widely believed, and it has colored perceptions of the man ever since. The Henry Every. Of legend is a romantic figure, the gentleman pirate who beat the system and lived happily ever after. And this image has proved remarkably durable, surviving in songs and stories, and eventually in the popular imagination of what piracy itself means. The truth, so far as modern scholarship has been able to reconstruct it, is both grimmer and stranger. The man himself remains elusive, appearing in the documentary record for only a few years before vanishing forever. And even within that brief window, our knowledge is fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. His name appears in different documents as Every, Avery, and half a dozen other spellings. He sailed under the alias Benjamin Bridgman during the events that made him famous. We cannot be entirely certain when or where he was born, or what happened to him in the end. We can trace, with reasonable confidence, the broad outlines of his career and the sequence of events that brought him to the deck of the Fancy on that September morning. But the interior of the man, his thoughts, his motives, his character as something more than a sequence of actions, remains largely opaque. This is a story about what can be known and what cannot, about the strange gaps that history leaves us and the even stranger compulsion we feel to fill them in. It is a story about crime and consequence, about the collision between worlds, about the violence at the heart of empire and the violence at the heart of piracy, which were often, as we shall see, difficult to tell apart. And it is a story about disappearance, about a man who achieved something extraordinary and then chose, for reasons we will never fully understand, to let it all go and slip away into silence. Let us begin with the world he came from. Henry. Every was born, probably, around the year 1659, in the county of Devon in the southwest of England. This is an estimate based on descriptions of his age during the events of 1695, and it could be off by several years in either direction. The location is somewhat more certain. Multiple sources connect him to Devon, and specifically to the area around the great naval port of Plymouth, that same stretch of wind-scoured coastline that had produced Francis Drake a century before and would continue to send generations of English seamen out into the Atlantic and beyond. Devon in the late 17th century was a maritime county to its bones. The sea was everywhere, in the economy, in the conversation, in the family stories of ships and cargoes and distant places that every child grew up hearing. The great estuary of the River Tamar divided Devon from Cornwall to the west, and from the port of Plymouth, vessels sailed for the fisheries of Newfoundland, the slave markets of West Africa, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and the trading posts of India and the East. A boy growing up near Plymouth in the 1660s and 1670s would have known the names of ships before he knew the names of kings. He would have watched the great merchantmen riding at anchor in the Sound, counted their guns and measured their masts, listened to the sailors talk in the waterfront taverns, and understood from an early age that the sea was a ladder, that a clever boy with strong hands and steady nerves could climb aboard a ship as a cabin servant and climb off years later as a captain or a rich man or both. Or he might not climb off at all. The sea was also a grave. The mortality rate among English seamen of this period was staggering by modern standards. Disease, shipwreck, accident, and violence claimed hundreds of lives every year. A man who went to sea at 14 had perhaps even odds of seeing 40. And yet the ships kept sailing and the boys kept boarding them, because for the sons of Devon farmers and fishermen and tradesmen, the sea was also the only real escape from the fixed hierarchies of English society, the only road that might lead somewhere other than the life your father had lived, and his father before him. We do not know the circumstances of Every's family, beyond the fact that they were not wealthy or prominent enough to leave much of a trace in the historical record. He went to sea young, as boys of his class did, probably as a servant or cabin boy in his early teens, and he seems to have spent time in the Royal Navy, possibly seeing action in the Mediterranean during the various conflicts of the 1670s and 1680s. One source places him at the bombardment of Algiers, that heavily fortified city of the Barbary coast, where European powers periodically attempted to suppress the North African corsairs who preyed upon their shipping. Whether or not this specific detail is accurate, we can be confident that Every received a thorough education in seamanship, navigation, and violence during these formative years. The Royal Navy of the late Stuart period was a hard school, brutal in its discipline and democratic in its violence, and a man who survived and advanced through its ranks learned lessons that would serve him in any number of subsequent careers. By the early 1690s, Every had left the Navy, or the Navy had released him in one of the periodic reductions in force that occurred during peacetime, and had found new employment in one of the darkest branches of the maritime economy. He was working as a mate aboard ships engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. To understand what this meant, we must pause and consider the nature of the business itself. The slave trade of the 1690s was a vast and complex commercial system that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a triangular circuit of suffering and profit. English merchants bought or manufactured trade goods, cloth, metalwork, weapons, alcohol, beads, and an enormous variety of other commodities, and shipped them to the coast of West Africa, to trading posts and coastal forts scattered from Senegambia to the Bight of Benin. There, these goods were exchanged for human beings, captured in wars and raids in the African interior, and brought to the coast in coffles, chained together, to be sold to European traders who packed them into the holds of specially designed ships for the horrific middle passage across the Atlantic. Those who survived the voyage, and mortality rates of 20% or more were not unusual, were sold again in the Caribbean or the American colonies, exchanged for sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other tropical commodities that would complete the triangle by being shipped back to England for sale in European markets. The profits at each stage were enormous. The whole system depended on violence at every point, the violence of capture and enslavement in Africa, the violence of the Middle Passage itself, the violence of plantation slavery in the Americas. And the men who operated the ships that carried this human cargo were themselves often hardened to cruelty in ways that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Every served as a mate, a ship's officer, one step below the captain, aboard slaving vessels operating off the coast of West Africa. The specific details of his time in this trade are murky, but one account suggests that he was not above acts of treachery, even by the low standards of his profession. According to this source, Every was involved in at least one incident in which African traders who had come aboard his ship to conduct business were themselves seized and sold into slavery, a violation of even the minimal customs and understandings that governed the trade. If true, this tells us something important about the man. He was willing to break the rules even of a lawless business when it served his interests, and he had already developed the cold practicality that would later make him such an effective pirate captain. We should be careful here. The sources for Every's early life are thin and not always reliable, but the broad shape is consistent. A capable seaman, an experienced officer, a man already comfortable with violence and deception, looking for opportunity in a world where honest labor rarely led to riches, and where the line between legitimate commerce and outright crime was often difficult to locate. The opportunity, when it came, arrived in the form of a scheme so poorly planned and badly managed that it seems almost designed to produce a mutiny. In 1693, a consortium of English investors fitted out a small squadron of ships for a privateering expedition to the Caribbean. Privateering was a kind of licensed piracy. A private ship sailing under the authorization of a government was permitted to attack and capture the vessels of enemy nations in wartime and keep a portion of the proceeds. It was a legal arrangement that blurred the line between commerce and warfare, and it had made fortunes for men like Francis Drake in earlier generations. The expedition of 1693 was intended to operate under Spanish authorization, attacking French shipping in the Caribbean during the ongoing War of the Grand Alliance, with the profits to be split among the investors, the crews, and the Spanish crown. The plan was complex, the financing was shaky, and the administrative arrangements were a disaster from the start. The ships sailed from England to the northern Spanish port of La Coruña, where they were to receive their Spanish commissions and take on supplies before proceeding to the Caribbean. And there they sat. Month after month, the ships rode at anchor in the harbor while the financing collapsed, the promised Spanish licenses failed to materialize, and the crews, ordinary sailors who had signed on expecting steady pay and the chance of prize money, grew increasingly desperate. The men had not been paid in months. Many had families at home who depended on their wages and who were now facing destitution. Some of the sailors had been arrested for debt before joining the expedition and had expected their pay to settle their accounts. Instead, they found themselves trapped aboard ships that were going nowhere, unpaid, unfed, watching their futures dissolve while the expedition's backers argued among themselves and accomplished nothing. Henry Every was serving as first mate aboard one of these vessels, a ship called the Charles II. She was a capable vessel, well armed and reasonably fast, the kind of ship that could have been quite valuable in the right hands. Every had plenty of time during those long months in La Coruña to study the ship and her crew, to take the measure of his captain and the other officers, and to calculate, in his quiet, watchful way, the possibilities that the situation might offer. The captain of the Charles II was a man named Gibson, and he was, by all accounts, incompetent, frequently drunk, and increasingly unable to maintain discipline or inspire confidence in his crew. The men were not merely unhappy, they were desperate, angry, and beginning to talk among themselves about alternatives. Every, the experienced officer who had already demonstrated his willingness to operate outside the rules, was paying close attention to that talk. On the night of May 7, 1694, the crew of the Charles II mutinied. The mutiny was swift, professional, and bloodless, a testament to the planning that had gone into it and to the leadership of the man who now emerged at its head. The crew waited until Captain Gibson was asleep in his cabin, drunk as usual, and then moved quickly to secure the ship. Officers who refused to join were seized but not harmed. The loyal members of the crew were offered a choice: join the mutineers or be set ashore. Most chose to stay. By morning, the Charles II was under new management, and Henry Every was, by the democratic vote of the crew, her new captain. The mutineers immediately set about transforming themselves from desperate sailors into pirates. Every renamed the ship the Fancy, a name that suggests both playfulness and speed, and he set about modifying her for the work ahead. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his life on the water, that speed would be their greatest asset. A pirate ship could not stand toe-to-toe with a naval warship or even a well-armed merchantman in a prolonged fight. What she could do was choose her battles, run down the ships she could take, flee from the ships she couldn't, and outmaneuver anyone who tried to bring her to account. Every ordered the Fancy's upper works cut down to reduce weight and wind resistance. He had her hull scraped and cleaned, removing the accumulated growth that slowed every wooden ship after months at sea. He drilled his crew in the handling of the guns and the small arms. And then he set a course for the south. The immediate destination was the Cape Verde Islands, and then the coast of West Africa, where Every hoped to recruit additional crew and capture supply ships before attempting the long passage around the Cape of Good Hope. But the true destination, the strategic goal that Every seems to have had clearly in mind from the beginning, was the Indian Ocean, the richest hunting ground on Earth for a pirate willing to take the risk. This was a significant decision, and it tells us something about Every's calculations. The Caribbean, the traditional stamping ground of English pirates, was relatively well patrolled by the 1690s, and the pickings were increasingly slim. The wars of the previous decades had culled the merchant fleets of Spain and France, and the remaining prizes were often not worth the risk of capture. But the Indian Ocean was different. There, the great trading ships of the Mughal Empire sailed laden with wealth beyond the dreams of any Caribbean merchantman. Gold, silver, precious stones, silks, spices, and all the accumulated luxury of the richest empire in the world. These ships were often poorly defended, because the Mughal emperors had never faced a serious naval threat and had not developed the heavily armed merchantmen that Europeans had learned to build. A fast, well-armed ship with a determined crew might make a fortune in a single voyage. The risk, of course, was enormous. The Indian Ocean was a long way from any safe harbor that might shelter English pirates. The East India Company, which held England's monopoly on trade with the East, was fiercely protective of its relationship with the Mughal authorities and would do everything in its power to destroy any pirates who threatened that relationship. And the Mughal Empire itself, though it had no navy to speak of, ruled over more than 100 million subjects, and commanded resources that could make life very difficult for any European power that offended it. But Every had already bet everything when he seized the Fancy. His life was forfeit if he was ever caught and returned to England. The question was not whether to take risks, but which risks offered the best return. He chose the Indian Ocean. And over the following year, as the Fancy sailed south along the African coast and then east around the Cape of Good Hope into waters few Englishmen had ever seen, Henry proved himself to be exactly what his future legend would remember, one of the most capable ship commanders of his age. The voyage around Africa was itself a significant achievement. The Cape of Good Hope, at the southern tip of the African continent, was one of the most difficult passages in the world, a place where the cold waters of the Atlantic met the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, and where sudden storms could tear a ship apart without warning. Every navigated the passage successfully, keeping his crew healthy and his ship in fighting trim, and emerged into the Indian Ocean sometime in the first half of 1695. He made for the island of Madagascar, which had become a de facto base for pirates operating in these waters. There were no European authorities on Madagascar to speak of. The island's various kingdoms had their own politics, into which the occasional European sailor had inserted himself, but there was no colonial government, no port officials, no customs men asking inconvenient questions. A pirate could careen his ship on Madagascar's beaches, trade for supplies with the local chiefs, and recruit from the motley population of sailors, deserters, and outcasts who had washed up on those shores. Every did all of these things, strengthening his crew and preparing for the operation he had been planning since before he left Spain. He also made contact with other pirate vessels operating in the region. Several ships, drawn by the same calculations that had brought every halfway around the world, were converging on the same hunting ground. They knew what he knew, that once a year at the end of the Islamic pilgrimage season, a great fleet of Mughal ships sailed from the Red Sea port of Mocha back to the Indian port of Surat, carrying thousands of wealthy pilgrims returning from their journey to Mecca, along with the accumulated profits of a year of trade in Arabia. This convoy, sailing along the western coast of India, was one of the richest targets anywhere in the world, and one of the least defended. Every organized a temporary coalition. The sources name several ships that joined his impromptu squadron, including a vessel commanded by Thomas II, a famous Rhode Island pirate who had already made and lost one fortune in these same waters. Together, the pirates numbered perhaps 6 vessels, a formidable force by the standards of piracy, though still vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the great Mughal fleet they intended to attack. But numbers were not the deciding factor in Every's calculations. Speed was, surprise was, and fortune, the blind luck that had always seemed to favor him, would prove decisive once again. They positioned themselves at the mouth of the Red Sea, at the narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, where the shipping from Arabia was forced to pass through a choke point that made interception possible. And there they waited, watching for sails, while the monsoon winds shifted and the late summer heat pressed down on the water like a hand. The Mughal convoy slipped past them in the darkness. It must have seemed for one terrible moment that the whole voyage had been for nothing, that they had sailed 20,000 miles around the world through storms and disease and the vast, indifferent ocean, only to miss their moment while they slept at anchor. The fleet had passed in the night, taking advantage of the darkness and the wind, and by the time the pirates realized what had happened, the Mughal ships were already sailing east toward India, their sails visible on the morning horizon, but their lead substantial and growing. Every did not hesitate. He ordered pursuit. The Fancy was fast, the fastest ship in those waters, quite probably, and Every had spent a year making her faster still. Now that speed would be tested against the greatest prize any of them had ever seen. The other pirate vessels fell behind, unable to keep pace, but Every pressed on, his crew working the sails with desperate precision, the bow cutting through the warm blue water in a spray of white foam. The chase lasted hours. The sun rose higher, the heat intensified, and slowly, inexorably, the gap began to close. The Mughal fleet consisted of perhaps 25 vessels, but 2 of them stood out from the rest. One was a large escort ship called the Fateh Muhammad, well armed and carrying a substantial cargo. The other was the prize of prizes, the Ganji Sawai. The name means, in Persian, the exceeding treasure, and for once, a name lived up to its promise. The Ganji Sawai was the largest ship operating out of the great Indian port of Surat, a vessel of perhaps only 500 tons, carrying 80 cannons and a guard of 400 soldiers with matchlock muskets. She belonged personally to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb himself, the most powerful monarch in the world, the ruler of an empire that stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal and contained perhaps 150 million subjects. And she was returning from Mecca loaded with treasure, gold, silver, precious gems, and all the accumulated wealth of the pilgrims and merchants who had traveled to Arabia that year. According to some accounts, her passengers included relatives of the emperor himself, along with other high-ranking members of the Mughal aristocracy. The fancy caught the Fateh Muhammad first. The smaller escort vessel was overtaken and brought to battle without enormous difficulty. The pirates boarded, overcame what resistance there was, and began ransacking the ship for valuables. They found a respectable haul, 50 or 60,000 pounds according to most estimates, a fortune by any ordinary measure, but every barely paused to celebrate. The true prize was still ahead, still sailing for the Indian coast, and he had come too far to settle for second place. He left the Fateh Muhammad behind and pressed on. The chase for the Ganji Sawai must have been an extraordinary scene, though no painter was present to record it. The great Mughal ship, huge and heavy and laden with treasure, her deck crowded with passengers and soldiers, her 80 guns run out and ready. The smaller pirate vessel, low and fast and deadly, closing the distance hour by hour, her crew silent at their stations, watching the gap narrow with the focused intensity of predators. The warm haze of the Arabian Sea rising off the water, the sun climbing toward noon. And every on his quarterdeck, that quiet, watchful man, calculating angles and distances and odds, waiting for his moment. They caught her, and in the first minutes of the battle, fortune once again chose Henry Every's side. One of the great cannons aboard the Ganji Sawai exploded. This was not an uncommon event. Poorly maintained artillery, improperly loaded charges, flawed casting in the gun's manufacture, any of these could cause a cannon to burst when fired, killing its own crew and spreading chaos among the defenders. But the timing was catastrophic for the Mughal ship. In the opening exchange of fire, as the two vessels maneuvered for advantage, the explosion tore through the Ganji Sawai's gun deck, killing and maiming the sailors who were supposed to be working the guns and throwing the entire defense into confusion. At almost the same moment, a shot from the Fancy, aimed or lucky we cannot know, brought down the Ganji Sawai's mainmast. The great ship lurched and slowed, crippled, her ability to maneuver suddenly gone, her deck a chaos of fallen rigging and screaming men. Every closed in. The Fancy's guns fired broadside after broadside into the larger vessel, sweeping her decks with grapeshot and canister, killing and wounding scores of the defenders who had expected their great ship to simply overwhelm any attacker. And then the pirates boarded. The fighting aboard the Ganji Sawai was savage and prolonged. The Mughal soldiers fought hard, as men fight when they are defending their families and their fortunes and everything they own. But the pirates had the momentum, the fury of men who had sailed 20,000 miles for this moment, and in the end, the outcome was never really in doubt. The defenders were driven back, overwhelmed, killed, and then began what happened next, which has darkened Henry Every's name ever since, and which must be told honestly, without the romance that so many later accounts have tried to layer over it. What followed the battle was not swashbuckling adventure. It was atrocity. For several days, the accounts vary on the precise duration, the pirates held the Ganji Sawai and her people in their power, and during that time they committed acts of extraordinary brutality against men, women, and children alike. They tortured male passengers to make them reveal where valuables were hidden, and the tortures were not gentle. They violated the women, hundreds of women, many of them pilgrims returning from the holiest site in Islam, many of them from noble families, with a systematic and sustained cruelty that left survivors describing scenes of such horror that some women threw themselves overboard rather than endure what they had witnessed happening to others, while others killed themselves with their own daggers. This was not incidental violence, the chaos of battle carrying over into its aftermath. This was sustained predation, days of it, while the pirates systematically extracted everything of value from their victims before finally departing. The Mughal and English sources largely agree on these details, which gives them considerable weight. The English accounts come partly from trial testimony by men who were present and who, facing the gallows, had little reason to embellish the crimes of their former comrades. The Mughal accounts come from official reports and chronicles that had every political reason to exaggerate, but which describe specifics consistent with the English sources. The truth, as best we can reconstruct it, is that Henry Every's greatest triumph was also his greatest crime, that the single richest act of robbery in the history of piracy was accompanied by crimes against humanity on a scale that shocked even the hardened observers of that violent age. This matters. It should color everything that follows. The legend of Henry Every as the gentleman pirate, the clever rogue who beat the system and lived happily ever after, has always been a lie, or at best, a selective telling that edits out the ugliest truths. The man who walked off the deck of the Ganges Sawai with his fortune was walking over the bodies of the people he had murdered, walking past the survivors of what he had permitted and participated in, carrying wealth that had been extracted through torture and stolen from the dead. Whatever happened to him afterward, this is what he did to earn it. And yet the world he lived in was not ours, and the violence he committed, while shocking, was not entirely different in kind from the violence that was being committed every day with official sanction by the respectable powers of Europe. The East India Company, whose officials would later express such horror at Every's crimes, was itself engaged in activities, the slave trade, the exploitation of colonial populations, the enforcement of monopolies through military force, that would be judged criminal by any modern standard. The difference between a pirate and a privateer was often nothing more than a piece of paper. The difference between a pirate massacre and a colonial war was largely a matter of whose flag was flying overhead. This does not excuse what Every did. Nothing excuses what Every did. But it places him within a context that makes his choices, if not less terrible, at least less anomalous, less the eruption of some unique evil, and more the logical extension of a system that had violence at its heart. The men who would later hunt him so relentlessly were not hunting him because they were horrified by violence. They were hunting him because his violence threatened their profits. The treasure he seized was, by any measure, staggering. Modern historians have attempted to calculate the value of what was taken from the Ganges Sawai, and while the estimates vary, they agree on the essential point. This was the richest single prize in the history of piracy, before or since. Contemporary accounts mention figures ranging from several £100,000 to more than £500,000 at a time when a skilled laborer in England might earn £15 or £20 in an entire year. The most careful modern estimates cluster around £600,000, which would be worth something on the order of $100 million in modern purchasing power, possibly considerably more. When this treasure was divided among the crew of the Fancy, according to the rough democratic customs of pirate distribution, shares allocated by rank and roll, with the captain typically receiving 2 or perhaps 3 shares to an ordinary sailor's one, each common crewman received approximately £1,000. This was a sum that represented decades of ordinary wages, a fortune that would allow a working man to retire in comfort and never labor again for the rest of his life. The captain's share was substantially larger. Henry Every, the quiet sailor from Devon who had been working as a mate on slave ships just a few years before, was now one of the wealthiest men ever to sail the seas. And he had the cold intelligence to understand exactly what that meant and exactly what he needed to do next. The Indian Ocean, which had seemed so inviting when he entered it a year ago, was about to become the most dangerous place on earth for Henry Every and his crew. Word of what had happened to the Ganges Sawai would spread quickly, was probably already spreading, and when it reached the Mughal emperor, the response would be swift and terrible. Not against Every himself, perhaps, who was beyond the emperor's reach, but against the English traders in India, the men of the East India Company who maintained their factories and trading posts at the pleasure of Mughal authority, and who would now be held responsible for the crimes of their countrymen. The company's officials would have every motivation to hunt Every down, and they had resources that no pirate could hope to match. Beyond the company, there was the Royal Navy, the colonial authorities, the machinery of the English state itself. What Every had done was not merely a crime against the Mughal Empire. It was a crime against English commercial interests, against the political relationships that made the Eastern trade possible, against the delicate web of treaties and understandings that allowed English merchants to operate in a world where they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The English government could not afford to let this go unpunished, not if it wanted to maintain any relationship with the Mughal court. Every had to know this. He had to know that his position in the Indian Ocean was now untenable, that every harbor where English ships called would soon be closed to him, that the price on his head would rise to levels that made betrayal nearly irresistible, even among men who might otherwise be sympathetic to pirates. He did the smartest thing he could have done. He ran. The Fancy sailed west, back around the Cape of Good Hope, back into the Atlantic, heading for the one part of the world where English authority was weak enough and corrupt enough that a man with sufficient treasure might still find shelter: the Caribbean. The voyage was long and dangerous, but Every had proven himself a master of long and dangerous voyages, and the Fancy, still fast, still well handled, made the passage without incident. By the spring of 1696, the most wanted man in the world had crossed 2 oceans and arrived in the Bahamas, at the small island of New Providence, a place that would later become famous as a pirate haven, but which was, in 1696, simply a colonial backwater with a corrupt governor who was willing to look the other way for the right price. Every paid the price. He is said to have given the governor a substantial bribe. Some accounts mention ivory and gold as well as hard currency, along with the Fancy herself, now too notorious to sail openly anywhere in the world. In exchange, he received safe harbor and the opportunity to disperse his crew, to allow each man to take his share and disappear into the vast anonymity of the colonial world. And then, one by one, they scattered. Some headed for the other Caribbean islands, some made for the North American colonies, some, fatally, decided to return to England, trusting that they could blend back into the anonymous mass of sailors and laborers in London, or Bristol, or Plymouth. Henry Every himself walked off the stage of recorded history. What happened to him next is the question that has haunted historians for more than 300 years, and the question that the rest of this story will attempt, so far as the fragmentary evidence allows, to answer. The fragments we have are tantalizing precisely because they refuse to resolve into a clear picture. They are scattered references, contradictory reports, dubious testimonies, and the kind of speculation that tends to accumulate around any figure who becomes a legend in his own time. To understand what might have happened to Henry Every after he disappeared from the Bahamas, we must first understand the world he was trying to disappear into and the machinery that was being assembled to find him. The news of the Ganges Sawai's capture reached England in the summer of 1696, carried by the relentless currents of maritime communication that connected the far corners of the trading world. It arrived as a catastrophe already in progress. The East India Company's agents in India had been living under the shadow of Mughal fury for months. In Surat, the great trading port where the company maintained its principal factory on the western coast, English merchants had been arrested, their goods seized, their freedom of movement abolished. The Mughal governor of the region, acting on orders from the Emperor Aurangzeb, had shut down English trade entirely. Armed guards surrounded the English factory, and for weeks the men inside had lived in genuine fear for their lives, uncertain whether they would be executed, imprisoned indefinitely, or simply held hostage until the pirates who had shamed the emperor were brought to justice. The company's representatives understood immediately that this was an existential threat. The trade with India was one of the most profitable enterprises in the English commercial world. The textiles, spices, and other goods that flowed through Surat and the other Indian ports were worth fortunes, and the company's shareholders, who included some of the most powerful men in England, would not tolerate their investment being destroyed by some rogue sailor from Devon. Desperate negotiations began. The company's agents in India prostrated themselves before Mughal authorities, offering compensation, promising justice, doing everything in their power to convince the emperor that the English nation as a whole should not be held responsible for the crimes of a handful of outlaws. They pledged that the pirates would be hunted down, captured, and punished with the full severity of English law. It was not an idle promise. In London, the machinery of state began to turn. The Lords Justices who governed England during King William's absence on the continent issued a proclamation in August of 1696 that declared Henry Every and his crew to be pirates, traitors, and enemies of all mankind. The proclamation commanded all loyal subjects to apprehend them wherever they might be found and offered a reward of £500 for Every's capture, a substantial sum roughly equivalent to 20 years' wages for a skilled craftsman. The East India Company added its own reward on top of this, bringing the total bounty to a figure that would have tempted almost anyone who knew where Every was hiding. The proclamation was distributed throughout the English-speaking world. Copies were sent to every colonial governor, to every naval commander, to every port where English ships called. It was posted in taverns and marketplaces from Boston to Barbados to the Cape of Good Hope. Every's description was circulated. A man of about 37 years of age, of middle stature, inclined to be fat with a dark complexion and a slight cast in one eye. This last detail, the hint of a lazy eye or a squint, was the kind of distinguishing feature that might actually help identify a man in a crowd, and it appears in multiple contemporary accounts. The machinery of early modern law enforcement, such as it was, had been set in motion, but the machinery was slow, and the world was vast, and Henry Every had a significant head start. By the time the proclamation was being posted in English ports, Every and his crew had already scattered from the Bahamas into the anonymous vastness of the colonial world. Some of them made for the North American colonies, that long strip of English settlement stretching from Massachusetts to the Carolinas, where a man with money and a false name might hope to establish himself as a respectable planter or merchant. Others went to the other Caribbean islands, to Jamaica or the Leeward Islands, places where the population was transient, and the authorities were often more interested in bribes than in enforcing warrants from London. A few, either homesick or overconfident, decided to return to England itself. It was these last men who would provide what little information we have about the Fancy's crew and its movements after the great robbery. In the months and years that followed, perhaps 24 of Every's men were apprehended in various parts of the Atlantic world. Some were caught in Ireland, where a group of them had apparently gone to ground. Others were picked up in colonial ports after spending their money too freely or talking too loosely in the wrong tavern. A few were betrayed by former shipmates who had decided that the reward money was worth more than pirate solidarity. And in the autumn of 1696, 6 of them were brought back to England in chains to stand trial at the Old Bailey, the first test of whether the government could actually deliver on its promises to the Mughal emperor. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of the era, and it ended in a result that embarrassed the government profoundly. The 6 men, Joseph Dawson, Edward Forsyth, William May, William Bishop, James Lewis, and John Sparks, were charged with piracy, a capital offense. The evidence against them seemed overwhelming. They had been found in possession of Mughal gold. They had been positively identified as members of Every's crew. Some of them had made statements that amounted to confessions. And yet, when the jury delivered its verdict, it was not guilty. The acquittal stunned the authorities. The reasons for it remain somewhat obscure. Contemporary accounts suggest that the jury may have been sympathetic to the defendants, viewing them as rough sailors who had simply taken an opportunity that presented itself rather than as the monsters that official propaganda portrayed. There may also have been skepticism about the legal technicalities of the case, since the crime had been committed in distant waters under circumstances that were difficult to prove in an English court. Whatever the reason, the verdict was intolerable to a government that had staked its diplomatic credibility on bringing the pirates to justice. The solution was to try the men again, this time on a different charge. The doctrine of double jeopardy, which would later become a cornerstone of Anglo-American jurisprudence, was not yet firmly established in English law, and the authorities found a way around it. The 6 pirates were retried, not for piracy, but for the original mutiny aboard the Charles II, the seizure of the ship in La Coruña harbor that had started the whole affair. This charge was easier to prove, since the mutiny had taken place in well-documented circumstances with numerous witnesses, and it carried the same penalty as piracy, death by hanging. This time, the jury convicted. On November 25, 1696, 5 of the 6 men, Forsyth May, Bishop Lewis, and Sparks, were hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping, the traditional site for the execution of maritime criminals, where their bodies would be left hanging in chains as a warning to other sailors who might be tempted to follow their example. The 6th man, Joseph Dawson, was reprieved at the last moment, having provided information that the authorities considered valuable. But Henry Every himself was not among them. Every name that was called at the Old Bailey, every man who climbed the scaffold at Execution Dock, only underscored the absence of the captain who had led them all. Where was he? The government desperately wanted to know. The East India Company desperately wanted to know. The Mughal emperor, whose wounded pride had still not been satisfied, desperately wanted to know. But no one seemed to have the answer. The search continued for years. Every's description was updated and recirculated. New rewards were offered. Informants were cultivated in every port where sailors gathered. The colonial governors were repeatedly instructed to be on the lookout, to question any new arrival who seemed to have money beyond what his apparent station would suggest, to investigate any rumor of former pirates living in their jurisdictions. The net that had been cast for Henry Every was the widest and finest that the English state had ever deployed in pursuit of a single criminal, and yet it caught nothing but empty water. There were sightings, of course. There are always sightings when a famous fugitive disappears, and the reports about Every were numerous and contradictory. He had been seen in Ireland, where some of his men had definitely gone. He had been seen in Scotland, which was still a separate kingdom with its own legal system and might offer some protection from English warrants. He had been seen in the English countryside, living quietly under a false name. He had returned to the sea and was now pirating in the Red Sea again, or in the Caribbean, or in the South China Sea. He had died of fever in Madagascar. He had been murdered by his own men for his share of the treasure. He had escaped to the Ottoman Empire, or to the Dutch colonies, or to some other place beyond the reach of English law. None of these reports could be confirmed. Many of them were probably wishful thinking or deliberate misinformation. The problem that faced anyone trying to track Every was fundamental. The world of the late 17th century was large, poorly documented, and full of men who moved from place to place without leaving records behind them. A sailor with money, a false name, and the discipline to keep his mouth shut could disappear into that world almost completely. Every appears to have had all three. The one substantial lead that the authorities ever developed pointed toward Ireland. This was where several of Every's crew had been captured, and there were persistent rumors that the captain himself had passed through the country at some point after leaving the Bahamas. Ireland made sense as a destination. It was close enough to England to be familiar ground for a Devon man, but it had its own local authorities who were often less efficient than their English counterparts. The Protestant ascendancy that ruled the country was more interested in maintaining its grip on the Catholic majority than in pursuing naval criminals on behalf of the East India Company. And Ireland had a long coastline with numerous small harbors where a man might land quietly and make his way inland without attracting attention. One of the most intriguing fragments of evidence comes from the testimony of a man named John Dan, one of Every's crew members who was captured in Rochester, England, in 1696. Dan had been found with a substantial quantity of Mughal gold sewn into his clothing, over 1,000 pounds worth, according to some accounts, and he was obviously terrified of hanging. Under interrogation, he provided what information he could about his former shipmates, including tantalizing hints about Every's possible movements. According to Dan, the crew had scattered from the Bahamas in different directions, with some going to Jamaica, some to the North American colonies, and some, including possibly Every himself, heading for Ireland by way of other intermediate stops. Dan's testimony was self-serving and should be treated with appropriate skepticism, but it was consistent with other fragments of evidence that pointed toward Ireland as a waypoint in Every's disappearance. What we do not have, and what we will never have unless some miraculous archival discovery is made, is any definitive evidence of where Every went after he left the Caribbean, or how long he lived, or how he died. The trail simply goes cold. The man who had made himself the most famous pirate in the world, whose name was known from London to Surat to Boston, somehow managed to step out of that fame and into obscurity, never to return. This absence of evidence has, inevitably, given rise to legend. Within a few years of Every's disappearance, a fictionalized account of his life was published under the title The Life and Adventures of Captain John Avery. This book, which was almost entirely invented, portrayed Every as having sailed to Madagascar after the Great Robbery and established a pirate kingdom there, ruling over a community of outlaws and enjoying his vast wealth until his death. The book was widely read and widely believed, and it helped to establish the myth of Madagascar as a pirate utopia that would persist for generations. There was no truth in it. Every never established a kingdom on Madagascar. He never ruled over anyone after he left the fancy. The book was a commercial entertainment, capitalizing on public fascination with pirates, and it should be read as such. A more persistent and more poignant legend is the one that was already mentioned. The story that Every returned to England found himself unable to safely convert his treasure into usable currency, and was cheated by the very merchants he trusted to help him. This story appears in various forms in the historical record, including in the second edition of Captain Charles Johnson's famous General History of the Pirates, published in 1728. According to this account, Every made his way back to the west of England. Some versions say to Bristol, others to Devon, carrying a fortune in diamonds and other precious stones that he had acquired in the division of the Ganges Sawai's treasure. Unable to sell these jewels openly without revealing his identity, he approached certain merchants who agreed to act as intermediaries, converting his gems to cash for a commission. But the merchants, recognizing that Every could never report their theft without exposing himself to arrest and execution, simply kept everything and gave him nothing. Every, according to this tale, spent his last years in desperate poverty, the richest thief in the world reduced to begging, dying at last without enough money to pay for his own burial. The story has the shape of a moral fable, the kind of tale that serves to reassure honest citizens that crime does not pay, and that Providence will ensure that the wicked are punished even when human justice fails. For exactly this reason, historians have long been suspicious of it. The story is almost too perfect, too neatly illustrating the principle that ill-gotten gains bring no lasting happiness. It may have been invented, or at least embellished by writers who wanted to provide a satisfying ending to a story that otherwise had none. The truth, that we simply do not know what happened to Every, was unsatisfying to contemporary audiences just as it is unsatisfying to us, and the human impulse to fill that gap with narrative is powerful. And yet the story is not impossible. The problem it describes, the difficulty of converting pirate treasure into usable wealth, was real and well documented. Many pirates found themselves in possession of riches they could not safely spend. Gold and silver coins were easier to dispose of, but distinctive goods like gems, fine textiles, or items bearing the marks of their original owners were dangerous. A merchant who recognized Mughal diamonds or Arabian gold jewelry might well ask questions about where they had come from, and the wrong answer could lead to the scaffold. Pirates who returned to England or the colonies often found themselves living in a kind of gilded poverty, rich on paper, but unable to convert their wealth to the ordinary goods of life without exposing themselves to arrest. Whether this was Every's fate, we cannot say. The evidence simply does not exist. What we can say is that the man who orchestrated the greatest robbery in the history of piracy, who triggered an international crisis, who became the subject of the first worldwide manhunt, who inspired generations of imitators and centuries of legends, somehow succeeded in doing the one thing that pirates almost never managed to do. He got away. Whether he spent his remaining years in comfort or in poverty, in England or in some distant corner of the world, he spent them free. The rope never tightened around his neck. The cage at execution dock never held his bones. In an age when the overwhelming majority of pirates died violently, either in battle or on the gallows, Every died in bed, somewhere, sometime, in circumstances that remain forever unknown. The consequences of what he had done, however, were not unknown at all. They rippled outward from that September morning in the Arabian Sea, shaping events for years and decades to come in ways that Evry himself could never have predicted, and probably never knew. The immediate crisis in India was eventually resolved, though it took years of negotiation, enormous payments of compensation, and repeated promises of improved security against pirates, before the Mughal authorities were satisfied enough to allow English trade to resume on anything like normal terms. The East India Company emerged from the episode chastened but intact, having learned hard lessons about the vulnerability of its position in India and the consequences of being associated with English lawlessness on the high seas. The company would never forget these lessons. In the decades that followed, it invested heavily in its own military capabilities, in relationships with Indian rulers at every level, and in the legal and diplomatic infrastructure that would allow it to control, or at least influence, the behavior of English sailors in eastern waters. The crisis that Evry had provoked became one of the formative experiences of the company's transition from a simple trading venture to the quasi-sovereign power that it would eventually become. The legal precedents established in the pursuit of Evry's crew also had lasting effects. The global manhunt, clumsy as it was by modern standards, established patterns of international law enforcement cooperation that would be refined and expanded in the centuries to come. The trials at the Old Bailey, despite the embarrassing acquittal in the first one, helped to clarify the legal procedures for prosecuting crimes committed on the high seas in waters that belonged to no nation and where jurisdiction was often unclear. The very concept of piracy as a crime against all mankind, hostis humani generis, the enemy of the human race, was strengthened by the Evry case, as governments recognized that they needed to cooperate against threats that no single nation could address alone. But perhaps the most lasting consequence of Evry's exploit was the inspiration it provided to others. The news of the Ganges Sawai's capture spread through the maritime world like fire through dry grass. In every port where sailors gathered, men heard the story of the quiet captain from Devon who had sailed to the east, seized the treasure ship of the great Mogul himself, and escaped with more wealth than any pirate had ever taken before. The story lost nothing in the telling. The treasure grew larger with each retelling. The resistance of the Mughal crew grew fiercer, and the cunning of Evry's escape grew more dramatic. By the time the tale reached the taverns of the Caribbean and the waterfronts of the American colonies, it had become the defining legend of what a pirate might achieve if he were bold enough, skilled enough, and lucky enough. The generation of pirates that followed, the men who would make the early 18th century the golden age of Atlantic piracy, grew up on this legend. When Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, first went to sea, the story of Henry Evry was already 20 years old and had achieved the status of myth. When Bartholomew Roberts began his career, Evry's exploit was the benchmark against which all pirate achievements were measured. When Samuel Bellamy and Charles Vane and Stead Bonnet and all the rest raised the black flag and set out to make their fortunes, they were sailing, in some sense, in the wake of the fancy, chasing a dream that Evry had proven was possible. The dream, of course, was mostly illusion. For every Evry who escaped with his fortune, there were hundreds of pirates who died in battle, or of disease, or on the gallows, with nothing to show for their short, violent careers. The pirates of the Golden Age were not romantic adventurers. They were, for the most part, desperate men who had chosen a path that led almost inevitably to an early and ugly death. But the legend of Evry allowed them to believe, against all evidence, that they might be the exception, that they might be the 1 in 1,000 who pulled off the great score and lived to enjoy it. In this sense, Evry's greatest legacy was not the treasure he stole or the crisis he provoked, but the false hope he inspired in the men who followed him to the scaffold. The legend itself continued to grow and evolve long after Evry was gone. The fictional account of his pirate kingdom on Madagascar was followed by other literary treatments, including a play by Charles Johnson, not the same Johnson who later wrote the general history of the pirates, that was performed in London in 1713 and portrayed Evry as a romantic hero who had won the heart of the Mughal emperor's granddaughter. This version of the story, in which every marries the princess he has captured and lives happily with her on his island kingdom, bore no resemblance to the historical reality, but it proved enormously popular. It established the template for the swashbuckling pirate romance that would persist through the centuries, from Robert Louis Stevenson to Hollywood, in which pirates are dashing outlaws rather than brutal criminals, and their crimes are softened by the glow of adventure and the promise of buried treasure. The real Henry Every would not have recognized himself in these fictions. The man who emerges from the historical record, fragmentary as it is, was not a romantic hero. He was a competent, ruthless, calculating professional, a man who understood ships and men and the mathematics of risk and reward. He was capable of terrible cruelty, as the women of the Ganges Sawai discovered to their horror. He was also capable of remarkable discipline and foresight, as his escape from the Indian Ocean and his successful disappearance demonstrate. He was, in short, a human being of considerable ability who chose to apply that ability to theft and violence on a grand scale, and who succeeded in evading the consequences that would have destroyed a lesser or less lucky man. Whether we admire him or condemn him, and the honest answer is probably both, in different measures, we cannot ignore him. He stands at a hinge point in the history of European expansion, a moment when the vulnerabilities of the global trading system were exposed, and the powers that controlled that system were forced to adapt. The East India Company that emerged from the Every crisis was a different institution than the one that had entered it, more powerful, more militarized, more conscious of the need to project force across vast distances. The naval presence that Britain eventually established in the Indian Ocean was, in part, a response to the threat that Every had embodied. The legal frameworks that would eventually suppress piracy in the Atlantic and beyond were tested and strengthened in the pursuit of his crew. And somewhere, in a place that no historian will ever identify, the quiet man from Devon closed his eyes for the last time, carrying with him the secret of where he had been and how he had spent his stolen years. The sea did not remember him. The land, wherever he died, did not mark his grave. Only the legend remained, growing larger and stranger with each passing generation, until the real man was buried beneath the weight of all the stories that had been told about him, lost in the very fame that he had worked so hard to escape. The Arabian Sea still rolls in its ancient rhythms, warm and blue and indifferent to the cargo it once carried and the blood that was once spilled upon its waters. The pilgrims still sail to Mecca, though they travel now by airplane rather than by ship, and the route that the Ganges Sawai followed is no longer marked by the great merchant fleets of the Mughal Empire. The world that Every knew, the world of wooden ships and gunpowder and the slow accumulation of empire, has passed away almost entirely, replaced by something that would have been unimaginable to a sailor of the 17th century. But the questions that his story raises, about violence and wealth, about law and justice, about the gap between legend and truth, remain as urgent as they ever were. He was not a hero. He was not a villain, or not only a villain. He was a man who saw an opportunity and took it, who committed a crime that shocked the world, and then proved clever enough or lucky enough to escape the punishment that should have followed. His story is not a moral lesson, or not a simple one. It is a fragment of the past, incomplete and contradictory, raising more questions than it answers, leaving us to wonder at the strangeness of a world in which such things could happen and such men could exist. The Indian Ocean that Henry Every left behind in 1695 did not pause to mourn his departure or celebrate his escape. The monsoon winds continued their ancient cycle. The dhows and the great Mughal merchantmen continued their passages between Arabia and the Malabar coast, and the trade that had enriched nations for centuries continued to flow through channels carved deep by time and commerce. But something had shifted in those waters, something that the men who sailed them could feel, even if they could not yet name it. The balance of power that had seemed so stable, the vast and seemingly untouchable wealth of the Mughal trading fleets, the assumption that European interlopers could be tolerated as long as they brought silver and behaved themselves. All of this had been exposed as more fragile than anyone had imagined. A single ship crewed by desperate men with nothing to lose, had torn a hole in the fabric of the world's richest trading system, and the reverberations of that tear would take years to fully manifest. In the port of Surat, the largest and most important trading center on the western coast of India, the aftermath of Evry's attack played out in scenes of chaos and recrimination that the English merchants who witnessed them would never forget. The survivors of the Ganji Sawai and the Fateh Muhammad arrived bearing stories of horror that spread through the city like fire. The women who had been violated, many of them from prominent families, were now disgraced in ways that their society found unforgivable. Some, according to contemporary accounts, refused to leave their homes ever again. Others were rejected by their own families. The men who had been tortured and robbed were humiliated not only by their losses, but by their failure to defend their women and their ship. The entire Mughal establishment, from the local governor to the emperor himself, burned with a fury that demanded immediate and visible satisfaction. The East India Company's factory at Surat, a fortified trading post that had been the cornerstone of English commerce in India for decades, found itself besieged. Mughal soldiers surrounded the compound. English merchants were seized from the streets and thrown into prison. The company's president and his council were placed under house arrest, their goods confiscated, their trade suspended, their very lives hanging in the balance, while angry crowds gathered outside their walls demanding justice. The message from the Mughal authorities was brutally clear. The English would be held responsible for the actions of English pirates, and if they could not or would not deliver the culprits to face Mughal justice, then the English community in India would suffer the consequences. This was not an idle threat. The East India Company existed in India entirely at the pleasure of the Mughal emperor. Unlike the situation in the Americas, where European powers could carve out colonies in territories whose inhabitants lacked the military technology to resist effectively, India was a subcontinent of enormous wealth, vast armies, and sophisticated administration. The Mughal Empire, at its height, commanded resources that dwarfed those of any European state. Aurangzeb could field armies of hundreds of thousands of men. His revenue vastly exceeded that of the English crown. The company's trading posts were tiny enclaves, tolerated because they brought silver and luxury goods that the Mughal elite desired, but utterly dependent on the emperor's continued goodwill for their very survival. If Aurangzeb decided that the English were more trouble than they were worth, he could expel them from India entirely, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop him. The company's directors in London understood this with a clarity sharpened by panic. The dispatches that arrived from India in the months following Evry's attack painted a picture of impending catastrophe. Everything they had built over decades of patient negotiation and careful diplomacy was about to be destroyed by one man's greed. The annual trade with India, worth hundreds of thousands of pounds and absolutely essential to the English economy, was at risk. The entire future of English commerce in the East hung in the balance, and so the company threw itself into the pursuit of Henry Evry and his crew with a desperation that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with survival. The wanted posters that spread across the English-speaking world offered rewards unprecedented in the history of criminal pursuit. The Crown offered £500 for Evry's capture, already an enormous sum, more than most working men would earn in 2 decades. The company added another £500 on top of that, and then offered smaller but still substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of any of his crew. Colonial governors were ordered to search every ship that entered their ports, to question every sailor who might have information, to maintain constant vigilance for any sign of the vanished pirates. The network of English commerce, spanning the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, was transformed into a manhunt. And yet for all this effort, for all the money and the threats and the urgent dispatches, Evry himself remained utterly beyond reach. He had simply ceased to exist as a traceable person. The Fancy had been handed over to the corrupt governor of the Bahamas along with a substantial bribe, and the ship itself provided no further leads. The crew had scattered, each man carrying his fortune and his secret, most of them disappearing into the vast anonymous spaces of the colonial world. Some, as we have seen, were eventually caught and hanged, But these were the careless ones, the unlucky ones, the ones who could not resist returning to familiar places or spending their money too visibly. The smart ones, and every must have been among the smartest, simply vanished. The mechanics of how he did this deserve consideration, because they tell us something important about the world of the late 17th century. This was not yet the age of photography, of fingerprinting, of bureaucratic identity documents, of rapid communication. A man's identity was, in practical terms, whatever he said it was, verified only by the testimony of people who knew him. Change your name, move to a new place, tell a convincing story about your past, and you could become someone else entirely. Every who had already demonstrated his skill at strategic planning during the mutiny and the subsequent voyage would have understood this perfectly. He had the money to buy a new identity, to establish himself in a new place, to live quietly without ever needing to work or to draw attention to himself. He had the discipline, which his actions had repeatedly demonstrated, to stick to whatever plan he had made. And he had the most powerful motivation of all. He knew that his life depended on never being found. The contemporary accounts that tried to track his movements after his disappearance from the Bahamas are a confused tangle of rumors, speculation, and obvious fantasy. Some said he went to Ireland, which would have made sense. Ireland in the 1690s was a chaotic place, still reeling from the Williamite Wars, full of displaced people and uncertain loyalties. A place where a man with money and a good story might easily lose himself. Some said he returned to his native Devon, the most dangerous choice imaginable, but perhaps the most psychologically compelling, the pull of home proving stronger than prudence. Some said he went to the American colonies, to the Caribbean, to Madagascar, to places even more remote and untraceable. The truth is that none of these accounts can be verified, and all of them might be wrong. The story of his supposed impoverishment, the tale that he was cheated by Bristol merchants and died in poverty, is particularly difficult to assess. It appears in several early sources and has a certain moral tidiness that made it appealing to writers who wanted to draw lessons from his career. The great pirate, undone not by the forces of law and order, but by the very greed he had exploited in others. There is something satisfying about this narrative, something that suggests a cosmic justice operating beneath the chaos of the world. But satisfaction is not the same as truth. We have no actual evidence that this is what happened. We have only the story, repeated and embellished through generations of retelling until it became part of the every legend without ever being verified by fact. What we can say with confidence is that the machinery of pursuit never caught him. The manhunt continued for years. Rewards remained posted. Governors maintained their vigilance. But every never appeared in any dock, never stood in any courtroom, never faced the gallows that awaited his less fortunate crewmates. Whether this represents supreme cunning, extraordinary luck, or simply the limitations of 17th century law enforcement, we cannot know. Perhaps all three played their part. Meanwhile, in India, the crisis provoked by his attack gradually subsided, though not before it had produced lasting changes in the relationship between the East India Company and the Mughal Empire. The company's officials, desperate to appease Aurangzeb's wrath, made enormous concessions. They paid substantial compensation for the losses suffered by the Ganges Sawai's owners and passengers. They agreed to provide armed escorts for Mughal pilgrim ships, a commitment that drew the company deeper into naval activities in the Indian Ocean. They promised to pursue pirates with new vigor and to bear responsibility for any future attacks by English subjects on Mughal shipping. These promises were extracted under duress, but once made, they had lasting consequences. The company that emerged from the every crisis was a more militarized institution than the one that had entered it. The need to protect their own shipping and to fulfill their promises to the Mughals pushed them toward maintaining permanent armed forces in Indian waters. The vulnerability exposed by Every's attack, the fact that European pirates could strike at will and disappear into the vast spaces of the oceans, demanded a response that went beyond diplomacy and bribery. It demanded the projection of force, the permanent presence of ships capable of hunting down pirates and protecting commerce. This shift, driven by the immediate crisis, pointed toward the future trajectory of the company. Its gradual transformation from a trading venture into something more like an imperial power, possessing its own armies and navies, its own territories, its own laws. The pirates themselves, of course, drew their own lessons from every spectacular success. In the years immediately following the Ganges Sawai capture, the Indian Ocean experienced a dramatic increase in pirate activity. Men who had heard the stories of Every's haul, of the ordinary sailors who walked away with lifetimes of wages from a single morning's work, were drawn to those waters like moths to flame. Madagascar, that great island off the coast of East Africa, became a major pirate base, a place where men on the run from European justice could establish themselves, refit their ships, and sally forth against the rich Indian trade. The so-called pirate round, the triangular voyage from the Atlantic colonies to Madagascar to the Red Sea and back, became a recognized career path for ambitious criminals. For a few years in the late 1690s and early 1700s, piracy in the Indian Ocean reached levels that threatened to strangle the trade that made the great companies profitable. The most famous figure to emerge from this period was Thomas Tew, who had actually been present at Every's great capture, commanding one of the smaller vessels in the pirate squadron. Tew became a celebrity in the American colonies, welcomed in some ports as a successful businessman who happened to have made his money by robbery rather than more conventional means. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, that he was entertained at dinner by the colonial governor of New York, who found him charming company. The line between pirate and merchant, between criminal and entrepreneur, was never as clear in this period as later moralists would like to believe. Men like Tew and Every operated in a world where the violence of the slave trade, the violence of colonial expansion, the violence of European wars, all mingled together in ways that made their particular brand of violence seem less exceptional than it might appear to modern eyes. But this golden age of Indian Ocean piracy was brief. The powers that controlled the trade were not going to tolerate indefinite predation on their commerce. The East India Company lobbied vigorously for naval intervention. The English Crown, conscious of its obligations to Mughal allies and its interest in protecting commerce, eventually responded. By the early 18th century, naval squadrons were being deployed specifically to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. The Madagascar bases were attacked. The pirates who had made their fortunes in those waters found themselves increasingly pressed, increasingly hunted, increasingly unwelcome in the ports that had once sheltered them. Some drifted back to the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, and the American coast, where the great age of Atlantic piracy was just beginning. Others were caught and hanged. Others simply retired, as Every had done, though few managed it as successfully. The legal and institutional responses to Every's crime also had lasting significance. The trial of his captured crewmen in London in 1696 was a landmark event in the development of piracy law. The first trial, as we have noted, ended in acquittal, a verdict that horrified the government and exposed the inadequacies of existing legal procedures for dealing with maritime crimes. The jury had not been convinced that the evidence against the defendants met the legal requirements for conviction, and they had voted accordingly, despite intense pressure from the prosecution. This was, in its way, a triumph of due process. The system had worked as it was supposed to work, requiring the prosecution to prove its case. But it was not a result that the government could accept. The response was a rapid tightening of the laws governing piracy trials. The defendants were immediately rearrested and charged with the mutiny rather than the piracy, a charge that was easier to prove since the basic facts were not in dispute. This time they were convicted and hanged, their bodies displayed in chains at the entrance to the Thames as a warning to others. But the legal reforms went beyond this single case. The Piracy Act of 1698 established new procedures for trying pirates that would make convictions easier to obtain. The definition of piracy was clarified and expanded. The jurisdiction of the Admiralty courts, which handled maritime cases, was strengthened. The legal tools that would be used to suppress the great age of Atlantic piracy in the following decades were forged, in part, in the fires of the Every crisis. This pattern, a spectacular crime exposing a vulnerability, followed by institutional adaptation that reduces the likelihood of that crime recurring, is characteristic of how complex systems evolve. The global trading system that European powers were constructing in the late 17th century was full of vulnerabilities that no one had bothered to address because no one had exploited them yet. Every showed what a determined and competent criminal could accomplish within those vulnerabilities. His success forced the powers that controlled the system to close those gaps, to strengthen their defenses, to improve their coordination, to develop new legal and military tools for dealing with threats that had previously been dismissed as manageable nuisances. In this sense, Every was a transformative figure, not because of what he built, but because of what he destroyed. He destroyed the illusion that the Indian Ocean trade was safe from European predators. He destroyed the assumption that a single ship could not threaten the interests of empires. He destroyed the comfortable arrangement by which the East India Company had coexisted with local powers through diplomacy and commerce alone. In forcing the system to adapt, he helped shape the more aggressive, more militarized, more ruthlessly efficient imperial apparatus that would dominate the Indian Ocean in the century to come. Whether this should be counted as part of his legacy, whether he should bear any moral responsibility for consequences so far beyond his intention or imagination, is a question that the sources cannot answer. The world that Every knew was vanishing even as he lived through it. The wooden ships, the gunpowder weapons, the slow communications that made his escape possible, all of these would be transformed in the centuries that followed, replaced by technologies that would have seemed like magic to a sailor of his generation. The Mughal Empire that he had humiliated was already showing signs of the decline that would accelerate after Aurangzeb's death in 1707. The East India Company that he had nearly destroyed would grow, decade by decade, into the strange hybrid entity that eventually came to rule the Indian subcontinent outright, a trading company that became an empire, commanding armies and collecting taxes and administering justice over hundreds of millions of people. The piracy that he had practiced so successfully would be systematically suppressed, driven from one ocean to the next, until it survived only in remote corners of the world, in places where the power of states had not yet fully reached. But in 1695, none of this was yet visible. In 1695, there was only a fast ship in warm waters, a crew of desperate men, a prize beyond imagining appearing on the horizon. There was the calculation, the chase, the battle, the terrible hours that followed. There was the treasure divided, the ship abandoned, the long voyage home through waters that might at any moment reveal a pursuer. There was the dispersal, each man carrying his secret, each man knowing that his life depended on keeping it. And there was the silence that followed, the decades of silence during which Avery lived out whatever remained of his years, thinking whatever thoughts a man thinks when he has done what he did and gotten away with what he got away with. We cannot recover those thoughts. We cannot know whether he was haunted by the screams of the women aboard the Ganges Sawai, whether he lay awake at night in whatever bed he finally occupied, seeing their faces in the darkness. We cannot know whether he felt any guilt, any remorse, any of the emotions that a later age would expect a person to feel after committing atrocities. We cannot know whether he spent his stolen money wisely or foolishly, whether he found happiness or misery in his years of hiding, whether he ever dared to tell anyone the truth about who he was and what he had done. All of this is lost, as thoroughly lost as if it had never happened, recoverable only in imagination, never in fact. What remains is the story itself, incomplete as it is, the story of a man who came from nothing and achieved, for one terrible moment, everything that the pirates of his age dreamed of achieving. The story of a crime that shook empires and triggered hunts across continents and left scars that took decades to heal. The story of a disappearance so complete that 3 centuries of searching have added nothing to what was known within a few years of it happening. He became famous in his own lifetime, and that fame has never entirely faded. There have been plays and novels and films and academic studies, an entire literature devoted to a man about whom almost nothing certain can be said. The gap between what we know and what we imagine we know, between the historical Every and the legendary Every, is vast and probably unbridgeable. And yet the attempt to bridge it is not worthless. Because in trying to understand Henry, the real man, so far as we can recover him from the distortions of legend, we are also trying to understand the world that produced him. A world of wooden ships and canvas sails, of scurvy and typhoid and the constant proximity of death, a world of empires in collision where the wealth of continents was being violently redistributed by men with guns and no scruples. A world of rigid hierarchies and desperate poverty, where a common sailor might labor for years and never earn enough to buy a decent meal for his family, and where the knowledge that one successful voyage could change everything made the risks of piracy seem almost reasonable. A world that was recognizably the ancestor of our own and yet profoundly alien in its assumptions, its cruelties, its possibilities. Every stood at the intersection of all these forces. He was shaped by them, and he exploited them, and in his one great moment of success, he revealed something about them that would otherwise have remained hidden. He showed that the system had weaknesses. He showed that a determined man with the right skills could strike at its heart and escape the consequences. He showed in the most vivid way possible that the wealth of the world was not protected by any natural law, that it belonged to whoever was willing and able to take it. This was a lesson that the imperial powers did not want taught, and they responded to his teaching with all the force they could muster. But the lesson had been learned all the same, and other men would act on it in the years to come. The sun still rises over the Arabian Sea. The waters still warm under its light, still roll in their ancient patterns, still carry ships between continents as they have for thousands of years. The route that the Ganges Sawai followed, from Mocha to Surat, is still a busy shipping lane, though the vessels that traverse it now are steel-hulled container ships and oil tankers, not wooden galleons with canvas sails. The pilgrims still travel to Mecca, though they go by air now, and the dangers they face are measured in statistics about airline safety rather than in fears of pirates lurking beyond the horizon. The world has changed so completely that a sailor from Evry's time, transported somehow into our own, would recognize almost nothing about it. But some things do not change, or change only slowly. The human capacity for violence in pursuit of wealth has not diminished. The gap between the powerful and the powerless is, if anything, wider than it was in Evry's day. The ocean still does not care about human concerns, still claims the ships that venture out upon it when storms arise or equipment fails. And somewhere, in whatever grave or unmarked resting place received his bones, Henry, Evry still keeps his secret, as he kept it in life, as he will keep it forever. The question of what happened to Henry Evry after he stepped off the Fancy in the Bahamas in 1696 has consumed historians, treasure hunters, and amateur sleuths for more than 300 years. It is, in many ways, the perfect mystery. A man who committed the most spectacular crime of his age, whose face was known across the Atlantic world, whose name appeared on wanted notices in every port from Boston to Bombay, and who nevertheless managed to vanish so completely that not a single reliable witness ever came forward to say where he went, how he lived, or when he died. The absence is not merely frustrating, it is, in its way, as remarkable as the crime itself. Because in the densely networked world of late 17th century maritime commerce, where ships' logs and port records and merchants' correspondence tracked the movements of goods and men with surprising precision, disappearing was not easy. Especially for a man whose appearance had been described in official proclamations, whose associates were being hunted and hanged, whose name had become a byword for piracy itself. The very completeness of Evry's disappearance suggests planning, resources, and above all, a discipline that most of his fellow pirates conspicuously lacked. We should begin with what we know, or think we know, about his movements in the immediate aftermath of the great robbery. After dividing the treasure aboard the Ganges Sawai and the Fateh Mohammed, Evry sailed the Fancy westward, rounding the Cape of Good Hope and crossing the Atlantic toward the Caribbean. The choice itself is revealing. The Indian Ocean, which had been his hunting ground, was now far too dangerous. The Mughal emperor's fury had made every English ship in those waters a potential target for retaliation, and the East India Company was already mobilizing its resources to hunt down the pirates who had brought this catastrophe upon them. The Caribbean, by contrast, offered something that every needed desperately: a network of corrupt colonial officials who might be persuaded, for the right price, to look the other way, while he and his men converted their stolen treasure into something more portable and more anonymous than the gold and silver and jewels they had seized from the Mughal ship. Every arrived at the island of New Providence in the Bahamas sometime in the spring of 1696, and there he negotiated with the governor, a man named Nicholas Trott, whose reputation for corruption was already well established. The deal they struck was characteristically shrewd. Every gave Trott the Fancy herself, a ship that was now far too famous to sail safely under any flag, along with a substantial portion of the captured ivory and other goods. In return, Trott allowed the pirates to come ashore, dispose of their remaining cargo, and disperse in whatever direction they chose. It was a perfect arrangement for everyone involved. Trott received a fortune in bribes, the pirates received safe harbor and the freedom to scatter, and every received the one thing he wanted most of all: time and the opportunity to disappear. The dispersal of the Fancy's crew provides some of the best evidence we have about what happened next, because while every himself vanished, many of his men did not. Some remained in the Caribbean, spending their newfound wealth in the taverns and brothels of the islands until it was gone or until they were recognized and arrested. Others sailed for the American colonies, hoping to lose themselves in the growing towns of the eastern seaboard. A significant number made the fateful decision to return to England or Ireland, drawn by the pull of home, by the desire to see families they had left behind years earlier, by the belief, almost touchingly naive in retrospect, that they could simply resume their old lives as if nothing had happened. This last group paid the highest price. The manhunt that the East India Company had launched was unlike anything the Atlantic world had seen before. The company had agents in every major port, and it had offered rewards large enough to tempt even the most tight-lipped informant. The returning pirates found that the communities they had come home to were not safe havens, but hunting grounds, where any neighbor or acquaintance might be calculating the value of their heads. One by one, they were identified, arrested, and shipped to London to face trial. The trials themselves became public spectacles, eagerly followed by a population that had been fed sensational accounts of every's exploits for months. The first trial, held at the Old Bailey in October 1696, ended in an embarrassing acquittal. The jury apparently unconvinced by the evidence presented against the 6 defendants. The government was furious. The East India Company was apoplectic. The diplomatic damage from the original crime had been severe enough. An acquittal threatened to make it worse, signaling to the Mughal emperor that England could not or would not punish its own pirates. A second trial was hastily arranged, this time on charges of mutiny rather than piracy, and this time the outcome was different. The defendants were convicted and hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping, their bodies left to swing in the tide as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow Every's example. But Every himself was never among the captured. Not at the first trial, not at the second, not at any of the subsequent prosecutions that stretched on for years as more of his former crewmen were hunted down and brought to justice. His name appears constantly in the court records of this period. Witnesses mentioned him, prosecutors invoked him, his crimes were described in lurid detail. But he himself was a ghost, a presence felt everywhere and seen nowhere. The government had offered a substantial reward for his capture, £500 from the crown plus whatever the East India Company would add, a sum large enough to make any man who knew Every's whereabouts seriously consider betrayal. And yet no one came forward. No one turned him in. Either no one knew where he was, or those who knew were more afraid of him than they were tempted by the reward, or they were bound to him by something stronger than greed. The search extended far beyond England. The government sent orders to colonial governors throughout the Americas, demanding that they hunt for Every and report any sightings. Ships' captains were instructed to be on the lookout for him. Descriptions of his appearance were circulated, though these were necessarily vague. Every had been careful never to allow any portrait to be made, and the wanted notices could offer only general details about his height, his complexion, his manner. He was described as a man of medium height, well built, of a dark complexion, speaking with a Devon accent. characteristics that would have matched thousands of English sailors in the ports of the Atlantic world. The manhunt was vast in its ambition and meticulous in its organization, but it was hunting a shadow. The question of where Every went after leaving the Bahamas has generated theories ranging from the plausible to the fantastic. The most persistent legend, the one that captured the popular imagination in his own time and has never entirely released it, held that he sailed from Madagascar and there established a pirate kingdom, crowning himself a kind of buccaneer king and living out his days in tropical splendor surrounded by his ill-gotten wealth. This was the story told in a popular book published just a few years after his disappearance, a work that mixed a small amount of fact with a great deal of imagination and presented the whole thing as authentic biography. The Madagascar legend has a seductive appeal, the idea of the successful pirate who not only escaped with his treasure, but used it to build something lasting, who transcended mere criminality to become a founder and a sovereign. But there is no credible evidence that it ever happened. No contemporary accounts place Every in Madagascar after 1696. The pirate kingdom seems to have been the invention of a skillful author who understood what his readers wanted to believe. Other theories place him closer to home. Ireland was a frequent destination for pirates seeking to disappear, its western coasts remote and its population often hostile to English authority. Several of Every's crewmen are known to have gone there, and some witnesses at the London trials testified that Every himself had spoken of Ireland as a possible refuge. A man named James Houblon, a merchant with connections to the East India Company, wrote a letter in 1696 claiming that Every had been spotted in Dublin and was living there under an assumed name. The letter was taken seriously enough that the Irish authorities were instructed to search for him, but nothing came of it. If Every was ever in Ireland, he did not stay long enough or visibly enough to be caught. The most poignant legend, and the one that has proved most durable in the popular imagination, concerns his supposed return to England and his final years in poverty. This story, which circulated widely in the decades after his disappearance and was eventually incorporated into various fictionalized accounts of his life, holds that Every came back to Devon, to the country of his birth, carrying the bulk of his treasure in the form of diamonds and other precious stones. He could not sell these himself without revealing his identity, so he entrusted them to a group of merchants in Bristol who promised to dispose of them and forward him the proceeds. But the merchants, recognizing that Every could never seek legal redress, simply kept the jewels and sent him nothing. In this version of events, the greatest pirate of the age died in a Devon cottage, impoverished and alone, cheated at the last by respectable businessmen who proved themselves more ruthless than any buccaneer. The story has a moral neatness that should make us suspicious. It provides exactly the ending that a moralizing age would have wanted. The wicked man brought low, the stolen fortune lost, the universe in balance. It serves as a warning against the pirate's life, demonstrating that even the most successful criminal cannot escape justice forever, that sin carries its own punishment. Such stories were extremely popular in the 18th century, when the market for pirate narratives was booming, and writers understood that their audiences wanted both the vicarious thrill of criminality and the reassurance that virtue would ultimately triumph. The poverty legend may be true. It may also be exactly the kind of fable that would have been invented whether it was true or not. What we can say with some confidence is that Every understood, better than almost any pirate of his era, the importance of disappearing completely. The great weakness of most successful pirates was that they did not know when to stop. They accumulated wealth, but they could not resist the temptation to spend it ostentatiously, to attract attention, to play the role of the wealthy man in ports where questions were asked about where wealth came from. Every seems to have understood that the only safety lay in absolute anonymity, in becoming no one, in abandoning not just his name but his entire identity. He had spent his life among sailors and knew how they talked, how stories spread through the maritime world, how quickly a rumor could travel from one end of the Atlantic to the other. He knew that the price on his head would never be withdrawn, that the East India Company would never stop searching, that any hint of his whereabouts would bring the hunters down on him. His only chance was to become invisible, and that is precisely what he did. The technical requirements of such a disappearance were formidable. He would have needed to convert his treasure into a form that could be transported and spent without attracting attention. Gold and silver could be melted down and converted into coin, but the amounts involved were enormous. His personal share of the Ganji Sawai's treasure may have been worth tens of thousands of pounds. Moving that much wealth covertly, investing it safely, living off it without ever spending so much in one place that people began to wonder where it came from. These were problems that required sophisticated planning and probably required accomplices, bankers, or merchants willing to hold money and ask no questions. Perhaps the Bristol merchants of the poverty legend were real, but the arrangement they had with Every was voluntary, a practical solution to a practical problem that only failed when greed overcame whatever other considerations had originally bound them to silence. Perhaps there were others, in other cities, whose names have never appeared in any document that survived. We should also consider the possibility that Every did not return to England or Ireland at all, that he went somewhere else entirely, somewhere so remote or so unlikely that no one ever thought to look for him there. The American colonies offered possibilities. The frontier was advancing. New communities were springing up in places where a man's past might not be examined too closely, where an aging sailor with money and useful skills might build a new life without anyone asking how he had acquired his means. The Carolina backcountry, the settlements along the Chesapeake, the growing towns of New England, any of these might have sheltered a man who knew how to be quiet and who had resources enough to establish himself comfortably. He might have married, had children, become a respectable member of some colonial community, lived out his days as a farmer or a merchant, died and been buried under a name that meant nothing to anyone who did not know the secret beneath it. Or he might have returned to sea. This seems less likely. A man who had achieved what Every achieved had little reason to risk it again, and the sea was the one place where his face and his reputation might be recognized. But the possibility cannot be entirely excluded. Pirates did sometimes return to maritime life after years ashore, driven by poverty or boredom or the peculiar restlessness that afflicted men who had spent their formative years on the ocean. Every might have sailed under a false name on some merchantman or fishing vessel, might have lived out his final years in the element that had shaped him, might have died at sea in a storm or of fever in some distant port, his body consigned to the deep without ceremony or record. The truth is that we do not know, and absent some extraordinary archival discovery, a letter, a diary, a parish record that has escaped 3 centuries of searching, we will never know. Every's disappearance was too complete, too professional, too final. He walked off the stage of history in 1696 and never returned, leaving behind only questions and legends and the echoing silence of a man who understood that the greatest treasure of all was the freedom to be forgotten. What we can examine more profitably is what his disappearance meant to the world he left behind, how it was understood and interpreted by his contemporaries, and how it shaped the culture and politics of the decades that followed. Because Every's vanishing act was not merely a personal achievement, it was a symbolic event, a demonstration that the most wanted man in the world could escape the combined resources of the English crown and the East India Company and the Mughal Empire. This was a deeply unsettling message for the authorities, and they responded to it with a campaign of narrative control that was almost as intensive as the manhunt itself. The poverty legend that we have already examined was part of this campaign. If Every could not be caught and publicly punished, then at least he could be punished in story, brought low by fate or his own poor judgment, made to suffer for his crimes, even if that suffering happened offstage and could never be verified. The government and the company had a powerful interest in ensuring that every story ended badly, that it served as a warning rather than an inspiration. They could not hang him from the gallows at Wapping, but they could hang him in effigy, could ensure that every retelling of his tale emphasized the wages of sin, could make him a cautionary example even as he remained a romantic figure. The other pirates were punished with exemplary severity, their trials and executions staged as public theater designed to reinforce the message that piracy did not pay. The bodies of the hanged men were displayed at execution dock until they rotted, a visible reminder of the fate that awaited anyone who followed in Every's wake. The pamphlets that circulated after the trials emphasized the squalor and misery of the pirates' final days, the terror they felt as the noose was placed around their necks, the confessions and repentances they offered at the foot of the gallows. Whether these confessions were genuine or extracted, whether the repentances were sincere or performed, mattered less than the narrative they created. The pirates were to be understood as wretched men who had made terrible choices and paid the ultimate price. Every, though absent, was implicitly included in this moral accounting. But the campaign of narrative control was never entirely successful. For every pamphlet that emphasized the horrors of the pirate life, there was a ballad that celebrated its freedom. For every sermon that warned against the sin of covetousness, there was a tavern song that praised the boldness of the man who had stolen the Mughal emperor's treasure. Every became a kind of folk hero despite, or perhaps because of, the authorities' efforts to demonize him. He represented something that many ordinary people found appealing: the possibility of escape from the grinding hierarchies of early modern life, the dream of sudden wealth and absolute freedom, the fantasy of striking back at a system that exploited and oppressed the common man while enriching the powerful. The very completeness of his disappearance enhanced his legend, suggesting not failure but triumph, not punishment but reward. He had done what no one else had done, stolen more than anyone had ever stolen, and then vanished into a comfortable obscurity where he could enjoy his wealth without fear. This was the story that persisted, despite all efforts to replace it with a more morally acceptable version. The effects of Evry's crime rippled outward through the structures of international commerce and imperial politics for years. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb never entirely forgave the English for the attack on the Ganges Sawai, and the relationship between the East India Company and the Mughal court remained strained for a generation. The company was forced to pay enormous compensation to increase its naval patrols in Indian waters, to accept a degree of Mughal oversight that it had previously resisted. The experience taught the company lessons about the vulnerability of maritime commerce to determined criminals, lessons that would shape its approach to security for decades. It also demonstrated something about the limits of imperial power. The Mughal Empire, for all its wealth and military might, could not protect its ships on the open sea, could not project its authority into the waters beyond the horizon. This was a weakness that other pirates would note and exploit. The manhunt itself established precedents that would prove significant for the development of international law enforcement. The coordination between English authorities in London and their counterparts in the American colonies, in the Caribbean, in Ireland, in India. This was something new, a recognition that crime in the age of sail was necessarily transnational and required transnational responses. The wanted notices that circulated after Evry's crime, with their physical descriptions and lists of aliases, were early ancestors of modern international arrest warrants. The rewards offered for information, the pressure placed on colonial governors to cooperate, the systematic interrogation of captured pirates for intelligence about their still-free associates, all of these represented innovations in law enforcement that would be refined and expanded in the years to come. Evry's crime was so spectacular, so damaging, so embarrassing to the powerful interests it had harmed, that it forced the creation of new mechanisms for pursuing criminals across oceans and borders. And yet, for all the resources devoted to the hunt, for all the innovations it produced, the manhunt failed. Evry was never caught. The most wanted man in the world died free, somewhere, sometime, in circumstances that no one would ever know. This failure was itself instructive, a demonstration of the limits of state power even when that power was motivated by urgency and backed by substantial resources. The ocean was simply too vast, the number of places a man might hide too numerous, the mechanisms of identification too primitive. A man who was careful, who had resources, who understood how the system worked and where its gaps lay, such a man could slip through. Evry had done it, and others would try to do it again. The generation of pirates that followed, Evry took explicit inspiration from his example. When Blackbeard terrorized the Carolina coast in 1718, when Bartholomew Roberts captured 400 ships off the African coast, when 100 other men raised the black flag and ventured out to seek their fortunes, they were sailing in Evry's wake. His story had demonstrated that it was possible, that a common sailor with enough skill and enough ruthlessness could seize unimaginable wealth from the lords of the earth and escape the consequences. The romance of piracy, which would flourish in popular culture for centuries to come, found one of its foundational texts in Every's tale. He was proof that the dream was not merely a dream, that it had happened at least once, that a man could beat the odds and walk away with everything. The authorities understood this, which is why they worked so hard to reshape the narrative. The poverty legend, the cautionary tales, the emphasis on the hanged men at Wapping, all of this was an attempt to counter the romantic version, to insist that crime did not pay, that Every had failed in the end just as all pirates must fail. But the romantic version proved more durable, more infectious, more satisfying to the popular imagination. It persists to this day, in novels and films and video games, in the continuing fascination with the golden age of piracy that Every did so much to inaugurate. We want to believe that he escaped, that he lived happily ever after on his stolen treasure, that the system could be beaten by a clever and determined man. The poverty legend feels like propaganda, even if it might be true. The escape legend feels like justice, even if it might be fantasy. The morning sunlight still falls on the waters where Every made his fortune. The Arabian Sea rolls westward toward Africa, eastward toward India, its surface creased by the same winds that filled the sails of the Fancy more than 300 years ago. The shipping lanes are busier now than they were then, crowded with tankers and container ships and the occasional naval vessel patrolling against modern pirates who operate from the Somali coast in speedboats rather than from wooden ships with canvas sails. The ghosts of the old commerce have been replaced by the machinery of the new, and yet the fundamental geography has not changed. The narrows of Bab el Mandeb are still a choke point, still a place where the traffic of continents must pass through a vulnerable bottleneck, still a place where determined men with weapons might interrupt the flow of wealth from one part of the world to another. Every's tactical insight was not wrong. It has merely been adapted to new technologies and new political realities. The Ganji Sawai itself left little physical trace. We do not know what became of the great ship after Every's men finished with her. She was badly damaged in the battle, her mainmast shot away, her decks soaked with the blood of her defenders. Perhaps she was repaired and returned to service. Perhaps she was stripped and broken up. Perhaps she limped into some port and was abandoned there, her timbers slowly rotting into the harbored waters. No record of her ultimate fate has survived. The treasures she carried have dispersed into the general circulation of wealth, the gold melted and recoined 100 times, the silver flowing through the channels of commerce until any connection to its bloody origins was lost. The diamonds, if there were diamonds, may still exist somewhere. Stones do not decay as metal does, and a gem seized from the Ganji Sawai might conceivably sit today in some collection or some jewelry box, its history entirely unknown to its current owner. But this is speculation. We know that the treasure existed. We know that it was taken. We do not know where any part of it went after it left the hands of the men who took it. The Mughal Empire, that Every had so briefly and so dramatically challenged, would endure for another century and a half, but its greatest days were already behind it when the Fancy sailed into the Arabian Sea. Aurangzeb was the last of the great Mughal emperors, and his death in 1707 would begin a long decline that would eventually leave the subcontinent open to European conquest. The East India Company, that had scrambled to repair the damage from Every's crime, would grow steadily more powerful, would acquire territory and raise armies, would transform from a trading company into a colonial government, and would eventually rule over hundreds of millions of people in the name of a succession of British monarchs. The line of connection between Every's attack on the Ganji Sawai and the eventual establishment of the British Raj is not direct, but it is not entirely fanciful either. Every's crime forced the company to strengthen its naval presence in Indian waters, to take more seriously the security of the sea lanes, to develop closer relationships with Indian powers who might help protect British interests. These were small steps on a long road, but they were steps nonetheless, and they were taken in part because of what a Devon pirate had done to a Mughal treasure ship on a September morning in 1695. The ordinary sailors who had crewed the Fancy, the men who had followed Every into mutiny and piracy and murder, met various fates. Some were hanged. Some escaped to lives of anonymity in distant places. Some squandered their shares of the treasure in a few months of riotous living and died in poverty. A very few may have managed what Every managed, converting their plunder into the foundation of a respectable life and keeping their secret until they went to their graves. We know the names of some of them: Joseph Dawson, James Lewis, John Sparks, William May. But we know little else. They were ordinary men who had done an extraordinary thing and then returned to ordinariness, their moment of notoriety over, their lives resuming whatever shape lives resume when the adventure is finished and the treasure is spent. Most of them left no more trace than Every himself did. They passed through history like ships passing in the night, briefly illuminated in the light of a great event, and then swallowed again by the darkness that surrounds most human lives. The women of the Ganges Sawai, the pilgrims and wives and daughters who suffered at the hands of Every's crew, left no trace at all. We know they existed only because contemporary accounts mention them, usually in the context of describing the atrocities committed against them. Their names are not recorded, their faces are not described, their fates after the attack, whether they survived, whether they ever reached home, whether they bore children conceived in violence, whether they lived long lives or short ones, are entirely unknown. They are the silenced voices at the center of this story. The people for whom Every's great adventure was not an adventure at all, but a catastrophe, a trauma from which some of them never recovered. Any honest accounting of what happened in the Arabian Sea in September 1695 must include them, must acknowledge that the gold and silver and jewels came at a cost that was paid by human beings who had no part in the quarrel and no means of resistance. The sources do not allow us to know them as individuals, but we can at least remember that they were there, that they were real, that their suffering was the price of Every's success. The legend of Henry. Every did not die with the man himself. If anything, it grew stronger in his absence, fed by the very mystery that surrounded his disappearance. Within a few years of his vanishing, he had become the subject of a popular play staged in London, a dramatic entertainment that transformed the brutal pirate into something closer to a romantic hero. The play imagined Every as a kind of sea king, a man who had carved out his own kingdom beyond the reach of law and crowned himself ruler of a pirate utopia. It bore little resemblance to the actual man, but that hardly mattered. The public wanted a story, and the story they wanted was not one of atrocity and greed, but of freedom and daring, of a man who had defied the great powers of the world and gotten away with it. And so the legend took shape, and the legend outlived the truth. The timing of Every's crime placed him at a peculiar inflection point in the history of piracy itself. He operated in the brief window between the age of the buccaneers, the semi-legitimate privateers who had raided Spanish shipping in the Caribbean under loose commissions from England and France, and the golden age of piracy that would flourish in the early 18th century. The buccaneers had enjoyed a kind of informal sanction from European powers, who were happy to see Spanish wealth disrupted, and many of them had been able to retire to respectable lives when their raiding days were over. Every, by contrast, had no such cover. His crime was pure piracy, committed without any pretense of national purpose, and it was committed against a power with which England was not at war. He was, in legal terms, an enemy of all mankind, the first pirate of the new dispensation, the harbinger of a more lawless age to come. And the age that followed was lawless indeed. The quarter century after Every's disappearance saw an explosion of piracy in the Atlantic world, unlike anything that had come before. The reasons were complex, but they were rooted in the same conditions that had created Every himself. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713 threw thousands of experienced sailors out of work, men who had spent years in the Royal Navy or aboard privateering vessels, and now found themselves cast ashore with no prospects and no skills except those of seamanship and violence. The colonial ports of the Caribbean and the American coast offered little honest employment for such men, but the sea lanes of the Atlantic offered rich opportunities for those willing to take them. And so the pirates came, in numbers that had never been seen before, preying on the trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in the great triangular commerce of slaves, sugar, and manufactured goods. These were the pirates whose names would become famous, the men of the Golden Age. Edward Teach, whom the world remembers as Blackbeard, with his fearsome appearance and his flair for theatrical intimidation. Charles Vane, who was said to be cruel even by pirate standards, and who met his end on a gallows in Jamaica. Calico Jack Rackham, who sailed with two of the most famous pirates of all, the women Anne Bonny and Mary Red. And Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the age by most measures, who captured over 400 ships in a career that lasted less than 4 years. Each of these men, and dozens of others whose names have been forgotten, sailed out onto the Atlantic in the years after Every's great crime, and many of them must have known his story. Every had proven that it was possible to seize a fortune so vast that it could transform a man's life, possible to escape the gallows and vanish into anonymity, possible to beat the system and live to spend the winnings. The legend of the Devon pirate who had robbed the Mughal emperor and disappeared was a beacon to every desperate sailor who dreamed of a way out of the grinding poverty and brutal discipline of life before the mast. The pirates of the Golden Age developed their own culture, their own codes, their own rough democracy, and historians have argued ever since about what it meant. Some have seen in pirate communities a kind of floating republic, an alternative to the rigid hierarchies of the legitimate maritime world, where common sailors could share in the profits of their labor and have a voice in the decisions that governed their lives. There is something to this interpretation. Pirate ships did operate on more egalitarian principles than naval vessels or merchant ships. Captains were elected and could be deposed. Plunder was divided according to agreed-upon formulas that gave ordinary crew members far larger shares than they would have received as honest sailors. Decisions were often made by vote, and articles of agreement were drawn up specifying the rights and duties of every man aboard. The pirates called themselves brethren, and there was a real solidarity among them that crossed the usual boundaries of class and, to some extent, race. But it is possible to romanticize this too much. The democracy of the pirate ship was a democracy of thieves and killers, and its egalitarianism extended only so far. The pirates preyed not only on wealthy merchants, but on poor sailors who crewed the ships they captured, and their treatment of captives ranged from the relatively humane to the sadistically cruel. They were not revolutionaries or social reformers. They were criminals, men who had opted out of legitimate society because the risks of the alternative seemed preferable to the certain misery of honest poverty. Their codes and their democracy were practical adaptations to the demands of their trade, not expressions of any coherent political philosophy. And their victims, the passengers and crews of the ships they took, the enslaved Africans whose presence on so many of the vessels they captured is often passed over in silence, the women who sometimes suffered at their hands as the women of the Ganges Sawai had suffered, were not participants in any democratic experiment, but prey, pure and simple. The response of the European powers to the pirate plague was slow at first, but it built inexorably. The same commercial expansion that had created the conditions for piracy also created the motivation to suppress it. The slave trade, the sugar trade, the trade in all the goods that flowed across the Atlantic in the early 18th century. These were too valuable to be left at the mercy of seaborne bandits. Navies were deployed. Colonial governors were empowered to try and execute pirates without the delays of transporting them back to Europe. Special legislation was passed making piracy easier to prosecute and harder to excuse. And one by one, the great pirates were hunted down and killed or captured. Blackbeard died in a pitched battle with Royal Navy sailors off the coast of North Carolina in 1718, fighting to the last, taking multiple gunshot and sword wounds before finally falling. Charles Vane was captured, tried, and hanged in Jamaica in 1721. Bartholomew Roberts was killed by grapeshot in a naval engagement off the coast of Africa in 1722, and his crew, over 250 men, were put on trial in the largest pirate trial in history, with 52 of them sentenced to death. By the mid-1720s, the Golden Age was over. The Atlantic was not safe exactly. It would never be entirely safe, but the epidemic of piracy that had terrorized the sea lanes for a generation had been broken. The suppression of piracy was accomplished by many means, but among the most effective was the simple strategy of offering pardons to those who surrendered voluntarily. Dozens of pirates, perhaps hundreds, accepted these pardons in the years around 1718 and 1719, turning themselves in to colonial authorities in exchange for clemency. Some of them returned to piracy afterward and met their ends on the gallows. Others managed to reintegrate into legitimate society, their crimes forgiven if not forgotten, their careers as pirates fading into memory. The pardons recognized a truth that the authorities had come to understand, that many pirates were not hardened criminals by nature, but ordinary sailors who had been pushed into outlawry by circumstance, and that it was cheaper and easier to bring them back into the fold than to hunt them all down and hang them. It was a pragmatic calculation, and it worked. The pardons drained manpower from pirate crews and undercut the sense of desperate solidarity that had held pirate communities together. When a man knew that surrender meant a noose, he had every reason to fight to the last. When surrender meant a fresh start, the calculus changed. Henry. Every had needed no pardon. He had simply disappeared, taking his fortune with him, and the very completeness of his escape had contributed to his legend. The pirates who came after him knew that the noose awaited most of them, that for every who got away, there were 100 who did not. And yet, they kept coming, kept sailing out onto the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean and the waters of the Caribbean, kept gambling their lives against the chance of fortune. What drove them is a question that admits no simple answer. Poverty, certainly, desperation, the brutal conditions of life aboard legitimate vessels, where discipline was maintained by the lash and the diet consisted of salt meat and weevil-infested biscuit. The dream of wealth, of freedom, of revenge against a world that had ground them down. Perhaps for some of them, something darker, a taste for violence, a pleasure in cruelty, a desire to dominate and destroy that found in piracy its perfect outlet. The pirates of the Golden Age were not a monolith. They were individuals, each with his own reasons for being there, his own history, his own capacity for both camaraderie and savagery. What united them was only the choice they had made, the decision to live outside the law and take what they could while they could. The world they operated in was changing around them even as they sailed it. The early 18th century was the high noon of the Atlantic slave trade, and slavery was the dark heart of the commercial system that the pirates both preyed upon and depended on. The ships they captured were very often slavers, loaded with human cargo bound for the plantations of the Caribbean and the American South. The ports they frequented were slave ports, built on the labor of enslaved people and serving economies that could not have existed without that labor. The pirates themselves occupied a strange position in this system. Some of them had been slavers before becoming pirates. Some of them continued to trade in enslaved people while flying the black flag. Others incorporated black sailors into their crews, men who had escaped from slavery or been taken from captured vessels. And on some pirate ships, these black crew members seem to have served on roughly equal terms with their white shipmates, receiving the same shares and voting in the same councils. But this was not consistent, and it was not motivated by any principled opposition to slavery. Pirates were opportunists, and their treatment of black people varied as widely as their treatment of anyone else. The enslaved Africans on the vessels that pirates captured were, in a sense, the most invisible actors in this entire drama. Their fates depended entirely on the whims of their captors. Sometimes pirates freed them, either from genuine sympathy or because they needed crew or simply because they had no use for them and did not want the trouble of keeping them confined. Sometimes pirates sold them, pocketing the proceeds as they would have from any other cargo. Sometimes they simply left them aboard captured vessels and sailed away, leaving the enslaved people's fate in the hands of whoever came along next. The sources that survive about the golden age of piracy are almost entirely silent about what these people experienced, what they thought, what they hoped for and feared. They appear in the records only as cargo, as numbers, as problems to be managed. But they were there, on ship after ship after ship, and their presence is the underground river that runs beneath the whole history of Atlantic piracy. the unspoken foundation of the commercial world that pirates both exploited and disrupted. The connection between piracy and empire is older than every and older than the Golden Age. From the beginning of European expansion into the Atlantic world, the line between legitimate commerce and outright piracy had been blurred. Francis Drake, the great Elizabethan sea captain, was a hero to the English and a pirate to the Spanish, and both assessments were accurate. The buccaneers of the 17th century operated under commissions that gave their raids a thin veneer of legality while allowing them to keep most of the proceeds for themselves. Even the East India Company, that pillar of legitimate commerce, had at various times engaged in practices that differed from piracy, mainly in having official sanction. The distinction between piracy and state-sponsored violence was often a matter of perspective, of who had the power to define the terms. The pirates of the Golden Age, lacking any state sponsorship, were simply exposed in a way that earlier generations of seaborne raiders had not been. They did the same things that their predecessors had done, but they did them without the cover that a commission or a flag of convenience provided, and for that they were hunted and hanged as criminals rather than celebrated as heroes. The irony, perhaps, is that the suppression of piracy helped to consolidate the very systems of empire and commerce that had given rise to piracy in the first place. With the pirates gone, or at least reduced to a manageable nuisance, the sea lanes became safe enough for the great trading companies to operate with confidence. The slave trade expanded. The plantation economies of the Caribbean grew richer and more brutal. The European powers tightened their grip on their colonial possessions, developing the administrative and military apparatus that would allow them to dominate much of the world for the next 2 centuries. The pirates had been, in their way, a symptom of the contradictions in the emerging Atlantic system, a product of its inequalities and its violence, and their suppression was a sign that the system had grown strong enough to police itself, to eliminate the free agents who had exploited its gaps and weaknesses. The golden age of piracy ended, and the golden age of empire began in earnest. But the legends remained. The pirates who had terrorized the Atlantic for a generation became, within a few decades of their deaths, figures of romance and adventure, heroes of ballads and novels and eventually films. The skull and crossbones, that flag of terror under which so many crimes had been committed, became a symbol of rebellious freedom, stripped of its historical associations with murder and rape and torture. The pirates were sanitized, transformed from violent criminals into lovable rogues, their victims forgotten, their crimes repackaged as daring exploits. This transformation tells us something about the human appetite for stories of transgression, for figures who break the rules and defy authority, for the fantasy of escape from the constraints of ordinary life. It tells us something, too, about the capacity of comfortable societies to forget the suffering on which their comforts were built, to turn atrocity into entertainment, to prefer the legend to the truth. Henry Every stands at the origin of this transformation. He was the prototype, the first pirate of the modern age to achieve genuine worldwide fame, and the mystery of his disappearance only enhanced his legend. Unlike Blackbeard, who died fighting, or Roberts, who was killed in battle, and whose crew was put on trial for the world to see, Every left no body, no grave, no final chapter. He simply vanished, and that vanishing allowed him to be anything that later generations wanted him to be. The play that dramatized his life a few years after his disappearance was only the first of countless fictional treatments, each one reshaping his story to fit the needs and fantasies of its audience. The real man, whoever he was lost almost immediately, buried beneath layers of legend and speculation and wishful thinking. What remained was the idea of him, the pirate who got away, the man who seized the treasure of the world's richest empire and lived to spend it, the sailor who beat the system and disappeared into the sunset with his gold. Whether he deserved that legend is another question. The historical Every, so far as we can recover him from the fragmentary sources, was a man of considerable ability, but also of considerable cruelty, a skilled navigator and natural leader who was also capable of organizing an atrocity. The attack on the Ganges Sawai was not a daring exploit in any morally neutral sense. It was a crime of extraordinary violence, inflicted on people who had done nothing to Evry and his crew, except have the misfortune to be aboard a ship full of treasure. The women who were assaulted, the men who were tortured, the passengers who were robbed of everything they possessed, these were real human beings, and their suffering was the price of Evry's success. Any honest assessment of his life must hold these facts alongside the legend, must refuse the easy romanticization that has clouded his memory for 3 centuries. And yet there is something in his story that resists simple moral condemnation, something that continues to fascinate even when the facts are known. Perhaps it is the sheer audacity of what he did, the scale of it, the way he gambled everything on a single throw and won. Perhaps it is the mystery of his ending, the refusal to be caught and punished, the final escape that so few pirates managed. Perhaps it is the glimpse his story offers into a world where the normal rules did not apply, where a man of no particular birth or wealth could, for a brief moment, seize more treasure than most kings possessed. The fantasy of such a life is powerful, even when we know what it cost those who got in its way. Evry's legend endures not because people are ignorant of his crimes, but because the fantasy of escape, of sudden wealth, of freedom from the constraints of ordinary life, speaks to something deep in the human imagination, something that all the moralizing in the world cannot quite extinguish. The Indian Ocean that Evry sailed into in the summer of 1695 was itself on the cusp of transformation. For centuries it had been the great highway of Asian and African trade, a vast network of commercial relationships linking the ports of India to the Arabian Peninsula, to the coast of East Africa, to the islands of Southeast Asia, to the distant markets of China. The Mughal Empire was only one of the powers whose wealth flowed across these waters. There were the merchants of Gujarat, whose ships had been sailing to Africa and Arabia for generations. There were the Omani Arabs, who dominated much of the western Indian Ocean and whose dhows were as familiar a sight as any European vessel. There were the various sultanates of the Indonesian archipelago, the traders of the Malabar coast, the remnants of the Portuguese commercial empire that had been the first European presence in these waters. The Indian Ocean was not an empty space waiting to be claimed by Europeans, but a crowded and complex world of its own, with its own systems of trade and law and diplomacy, its own hierarchies and rivalries, its own long history that had nothing to do with Europe. The European intrusion into this world had begun 2 centuries before Evry's time, when Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached the coast of India in 1498. The Portuguese had established a network of fortified trading posts around the rim of the Indian Ocean, attempting to control the flow of valuable commodities like pepper and cinnamon and cloves. They had never succeeded in monopolizing the trade. The ocean was too vast, the Asian traders too numerous and too capable, but they had established a European presence that would grow over the following centuries into something much more consequential. The Dutch came next, seizing many of the Portuguese positions and establishing their own dominance in the Spice Islands of Indonesia. The English came later, entering the competition through the East India Company, whose factors and ships had been working the Indian Ocean trade route since the early 17th century. By Evry's time, the European presence was still relatively modest. A few trading posts, a few forts, a few thousand men scattered across a vast region. But it was growing, and the trend of the future was already visible to those who knew how to read it. Evry's attack on the Ganges Sawai was, in this context, a moment of crisis in the relationship between the European newcomers and the established powers of the Indian Ocean world. The Mughal emperor was not accustomed to having his ships attacked by European pirates. He was the overlord of one of the wealthiest and most powerful states on earth, commanding armies that dwarfed anything the European trading companies could muster, ruling over a population larger than all of Europe combined. The English were in India on his sufferance, their trading posts existing only because he permitted them to exist, their profits flowing only because he allowed them to flow. When Evry's crew violated his ship and his subjects, Aurangzeb responded as any powerful sovereign would respond, with fury and with demands for justice. The East India Company, caught between an enraged emperor and a government back in London that cared more about profits than about the niceties of international relations, found itself scrambling to repair the damage. The crisis passed eventually. The company paid compensation, made promises, conducted what passed for a manhunt in the circumstances of the time. Aurangzeb, for reasons of his own, chose not to push the matter to the point of actually expelling the English from India. Perhaps he recognized that the English were useful to him in various ways, as a counterweight to other European powers, as a source of trade goods and military technology. Perhaps he simply had other priorities, other enemies closer to home who demanded his attention. Whatever the reason, the English presence in India survived Evry's crime, and the company continued its slow ascent toward dominance. But the lesson of the episode was not lost on anyone. It demonstrated, in vivid and unmistakable terms, that European lawlessness in Asian waters could have consequences far beyond the immediate victims of any particular crime. It showed that the Mughal emperor could, if he chose, make life very difficult for European traders, and it impressed upon the East India Company the need to take the security of the sea lanes seriously, to protect not just their own ships, but the broader commercial environment on which their profits depended. The company learned this lesson well. In the decades after Evry's crime, it gradually expanded its naval presence in Indian waters, building up a fleet of armed vessels capable of escorting merchant ships and hunting down pirates. It developed closer relationships with Indian rulers who had reason to want the sea lanes kept safe. It lobbied the British government for greater naval support and for legislation that would make it easier to prosecute pirates wherever they were caught. These efforts were not undertaken out of any abstract commitment to law and order, but out of cold commercial calculation. Piracy was bad for business, and the company was, above all else, a business. But the effect was to draw the British government more deeply into the affairs of the Indian Ocean, to establish precedents for the projection of British naval power into distant waters, to build the institutional foundations on which later imperial expansion would rest. The road from Evry's crime to the British Raj was long and winding, but it was a road nonetheless, and the attack on the Ganges Sawai was one of the events that set feet upon it. The transformation was not sudden, and no single observer at the time could have seen the full shape of what was emerging. The East India Company in 1695 was still, by the standards of what it would become, a relatively modest enterprise, its annual revenues dwarfed by the wealth of the Mughal treasury, its military capacity laughable compared to the armies of Aurangzeb. A century and a half later, that same company would rule over more than 100 million people, command armies larger than those of most European states, and effectively govern the entire Indian subcontinent on behalf of the British Crown. The transformation required many factors, many accidents of timing and circumstance, many decisions by many individuals whose names we remember and whose names we have forgotten. But it required, among other things, a certain understanding of how the Indian Ocean worked, what mattered in those waters, and how a relatively small European power could leverage its advantages, particularly its naval technology and its willingness to use violence systematically, to carve out an ever larger position in a world that had not invited it. Evry's crime was part of that education, not because anyone at the time articulated the lessons in those terms, but because the crisis it provoked forced the company to think harder about security, about the politics of the Indian Ocean, about the delicate balance of power between European traders and Asian sovereigns. The company that emerged from the crisis was not the same company that had entered it. It was a little more cautious, a little more aware of the risks, a little more determined to control the environment in which it operated. And each subsequent crisis, each subsequent lesson, pushed it a little further down the same road, until one day the trading company had become something altogether different, an empire, though it took a long time for anyone to call it by that name. This is the larger context in which Henry Evry's story must finally be placed. He was a pirate, a thief, a man who committed terrible crimes for personal gain, but he was also in ways he could not have understood and would not have cared about if he had a small but real force in the history of European expansion into Asia. His crime helped to shape the policies and institutions that would eventually transform the Indian Ocean from a space dominated by Asian powers into a British lake. The ship he attacked, the Ganges Sawai, carried the wealth and the people of an empire that would, within 2 centuries, be reduced to a dependency of the British Crown. The company he endangered, the East India Company, would become the instrument of that reduction. The captain of the Fancy could not have known any of this, and he would not have cared if he had. He wanted gold, and he took it, and he disappeared. But history is made by people who do not know they are making it, and the consequences of their actions ripple outward in patterns they never intended and could never foresee. There is something almost vertiginous in contemplating the gap between what every thought he was doing and what, in the longest view, he actually did. He thought he was stealing money. He was, in a sense, helping to build an empire. He thought he was retiring to obscurity with his fortune. He was, in a sense, becoming a footnote in one of the great transformations in world history. He would have laughed at the suggestion, or perhaps not understood it at all. He was a practical man, as his entire career demonstrated, a man who saw opportunities clearly and acted on them without excessive scruple. The grand patterns of historical change would have seemed to him, if he had ever paused to consider them, as distant and abstract as the movements of the stars. He dealt in the immediate, the tangible, the weighable, gold coins and musket balls and the wind in the sails. The rest was for other men to puzzle over. And yet the puzzling is worth doing, because it reveals something about the nature of historical change that is easy to forget. The great movements of history, the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of entire civilizations, are not driven by abstract forces moving through some ethereal realm above the heads of ordinary people. They are made up of thousands, millions of individual actions, each of them taken for individual reasons, each of them producing individual consequences that compound and combine in ways no one can predict. Evry's greed, the gunner's error that caused the cannon to explode, Aurangzeb's rage, the East India Company's fear for its profits, the decisions of thousands of other people in the months and years that followed, all of these were individual moments, individual choices, individual events, and together they added up to something that no one of them could have produced alone. History is not a river, flowing inevitably toward some predetermined destination. It is more like a vast and turbulent ocean in which countless currents cross and collide, and the patterns that emerge are visible only in retrospect to observers standing at a great distance in time. Evry stood at one of those crossings for a moment, and then he was gone. The currents flowed on without him. The patterns continued to form, and the world he left behind was, in ways he never imagined, a different world than the one he had entered. But there is another dimension to his legacy, one that operated not through the mechanisms of policy and power, but through the realm of imagination and myth. The legend of Henry Evry, the great pirate who stole the treasure of the Muggles and escaped to live out his days in freedom, took on a life of its own in the years after his disappearance. Ballads were sung about him in the taverns of London and Bristol and the ports of the American colonies. Pamphlets were printed purporting to tell his true story, mixing scraps of fact with vast quantities of invention. A play called The Successful Pirate was performed on the London stage in 1713, presenting a romanticized version of his career in which the pirate captain was transformed into a figure of roguish charm and ultimate triumph. The play was popular enough to be revived several times, and it helped to fix the image of Evry in the public mind as the prototype of the gentleman pirate, the outlaw who beats the system and lives to enjoy his gains. This image bore little relationship to the actual man. The Evry of the historical record was not charming or romantic. He was capable, ruthless, and pragmatic, a man who understood violence as a tool and used it without apparent hesitation when it served his purposes. The attack on the Ganges Sawai was not a dashing adventure, but a brutal assault, marked by torture and rape and murder on a scale that even contemporaries found shocking. The romance was invented afterward by writers and audiences who wanted the story to be something other than what it actually was, who wanted the pirate to be a hero, or at least an anti-hero, rather than what the evidence suggests he actually was, which was simply a very successful criminal. But the romance mattered because it shaped what came after. The early 18th century saw an explosion of piracy in the Atlantic and Caribbean, a golden age of buccaneering that produced figures like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts and Anne Bonny and all the other names that have echoed down through the centuries. Many of these pirates were inspired, directly or indirectly, by the legend of Henry Every. They had heard the stories, read the pamphlets, perhaps seen the play. They knew that one man had pulled off the impossible, had stolen a fortune beyond imagining and escaped to enjoy it, and they dreamed of doing the same. The fact that most of them would end their careers swinging from a gibbet, their bodies left to rot in chains as a warning to others, did not diminish the power of the dream. Every's example proved that it could be done, that the system could be beaten, that the risks could pay off, that a common sailor with enough skill and enough nerve could rise from nothing to riches in a single stroke. This was a dangerous dream, and the authorities of the time understood its danger. Part of the reason the government pursued Every's crew so relentlessly, conducting multiple trials and executing those they caught, was to destroy the legend, to demonstrate that piracy did not pay, that the arm of the law was long enough to reach even the most successful criminal. But the executions did not destroy the legend. If anything, they enhanced it, adding a note of tragedy and defiance to the romance. The pirates who died on the gallows were transformed, in popular imagination, into martyrs of a sort, men who had dared to challenge the established order and paid the ultimate price. The authorities could kill the pirates, but they could not kill the idea of piracy, and that idea continued to inspire new generations of would-be buccaneers for decades to come. The golden age of piracy that followed Every's disappearance was, in some sense, his legacy, not because he planned it or wanted it, but because his example made it possible. He had proven that the great ships of the Eastern trade were vulnerable, that even the mightiest vessels of the mightiest empires could be taken by determined men in fast ships. He had shown where the weak points were, where the treasure flowed, where the opportunities lay. And he had demonstrated, most importantly of all, that it was possible to get away with it. The pirates who followed him learned from his example, both his successes and his methods. They hunted the same waters, attacked the same shipping lanes, employed the same tactics. They were, in a sense, his students, though they never knew him and he never taught them. The currents of influence flowed through stories and songs and rumors, through the network of waterfront taverns and sailors' boarding houses where men who had sailed with Every, or claimed to have sailed with Every, passed on what they knew or claimed to know. But the golden age ended, as all ages end. By the 1720s, the combination of increased naval patrols, harsher penalties, and diminishing opportunities had broken the back of Atlantic piracy. The great pirates were dead or captured or disappeared into obscurity. The sea lanes were safer than they had been in decades. The merchants and the governments had won, as they usually do in the end, through the application of sufficient resources and sufficient violence over sufficient time. The romance of piracy persisted in literature and song, but the reality faded until piracy in the Atlantic became a curiosity rather than a crisis, a historical memory rather than a present threat. And yet the memory persisted, and persists still. Henry Every's story continued to be told in forms increasingly distant from the historical reality. He appeared in novels and plays and, eventually, in films, each iteration further removed from the actual man, each version shaped by the assumptions and desires of its own time. The Every of the 18th century pamphlets was a rogue and a rascal. The Every of the 19th century adventure stories was a gentleman and a rebel. The Every of the 20th century was a symbol of freedom and resistance against authority. Each age got the pirate it wanted, and none of them got the pirate that actually was. This is the final and perhaps the strangest aspect of Henry Every's legacy, that he became, after his disappearance, a kind of empty vessel into which successive generations poured their own fantasies and desires. The actual man vanished so completely that he could be remade again and again, in whatever image suited the purposes of whoever was doing the remaking. The mystery of his fate, the blank space at the end of his story, became not a frustration, but an opportunity. It allowed the imagination to fill in what the record could not provide. It made him, paradoxically, more powerful in death or in disappearance than he had ever been in life. The pirate who got away became the pirate who could never be caught, even by history itself. What then are we to make of him? What meaning can we extract from the story of this man who burned so brightly for so brief a moment and then vanished into the dark? The temptation is to find a moral, to conclude that crime does not pay, or that crime does pay, or that fortune favors the bold, or that pride goes before a fall. But the sources will not support any of these conclusions with certainty. If the Bristol legend is true, and every died in poverty, cheated of his fortune by men more cunning than himself, then the moral is clear. But we do not know if the legend is true. If he died wealthy and comfortable, having successfully laundered his gains and disappeared into respectable obscurity, then the moral points in a different direction. But we do not know if that is true either. The truth is that we do not know and will never know, and the story refuses to yield the neat conclusion that morality tales require. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the meaning of Henry Every's story lies precisely in its refusal to mean what we want it to mean. History is not a fable, and the people who lived it were not characters in a moral lesson. They were human beings, complicated and contradictory, acting under constraints and pressures that we can only partially reconstruct. Every was capable of brilliant seamanship and terrible cruelty, of shrewd calculation and impulsive violence, of loyalty to his crew and indifference to his victims. He was, in short, a human being, and human beings do not fit neatly into moral categories. The attempt to make him a hero or a villain, a success or a failure, misses the point. He was all of these things, and none of them, depending on when you looked and from what angle. What we can say with confidence is that he existed, that he did what the sources say he did, and that the world was different afterward. The ship he attacked, the company he endangered, the empire he offended, the pirates he inspired, all of these were real, and the effects rippled outward through time in ways we can trace and ways we cannot. He was a small man by any measure of the great movements of history, a single sailor in a vast ocean of events. But even small men leave marks, and his marks are still visible, if you know where to look for them. The warm waters of the Arabian Sea still flow between India and the Horn of Africa, as they have flowed for millennia. The shipping lanes are busy now with container ships and oil tankers, vessels larger than anything Every could have imagined, carrying cargoes whose value dwarfs even the treasure of the Ganges Sawai. The pirates are different now too, men in small boats with automatic weapons, operating out of lawless coasts, pursuing ransoms rather than plunder. But the fundamental dynamic is the same. There is wealth on the water, and there are men who will take it if they can, and there are authorities who will try to stop them. The sea remains, as it has always been, a space where the rules of the land grow thin, where the strong take from the weak, where fortune favors the bold and the prepared. Somewhere in that vast expanse, 3 centuries ago, a fast ship with a quiet captain waited in the haze for the sails of the richest fleet on earth. The captain knew exactly what he was doing. He had planned it for months, modified his ship for maximum speed, gathered his squadron, positioned himself at the choke point where the treasure had to pass. He was not a romantic or a dreamer. He was a professional, as cold and calculating as any merchant or admiral. He saw an opportunity, and he took it, and he won. And then he did the thing that no one expected, the thing that made his legend. He stopped. He took his winnings, and he walked away. He did not push his luck, did not attempt a second strike, did not let success go to his head. He understood, as most gamblers do not understand, that the odds always favor the house in the long run, and that the only way to beat the house is to leave the table while you are ahead. He left the table. He cashed in his chips. He vanished into the anonymity that he had purchased with the greatest heist in the history of piracy. Whether he lived well or poorly afterward, whether he died rich or penniless, whether his final years were spent in comfort or in regret, we do not know and will never know. The man himself is lost to us, as surely as if he had sailed off the edge of the world. But the questions remain, and the legend remains, and the warm dark waters remain, and the morning light still falls on the Arabian Sea, on the waves where, For one moment in the long morning of the modern world, a quiet sailor from Devon reached out and touched the wealth of emperors, and then let go and slipped away into the silence that still keeps him. The sea does not remember. The sea never remembers. It takes what is given to it and gives nothing back, not names, not stories, not the bones of the dead. The currents that carried the Fancy westward after the great robbery have long since dispersed into the general motion of the deep, indistinguishable now from any other water. The winds that filled her sails have blown themselves out centuries ago, their force absorbed into the endless circulation of the atmosphere. Nothing remains in any physical sense of the moment when Henry Every stood on his quarterdeck and watched the Ganges Sawai grow larger against the horizon. The atoms that made up his body have long since scattered into the earth and air and water of the world, recycled into 1,000 other forms, indifferent to the name they once briefly bore. And yet, the story persists. That is the strange thing, the thing that separates human beings from the material world that makes them. We die, and the molecules disperse, and the physical traces fade, but the stories survive, passed from mouth to mouth, from page to page, from one generation to the next. Henry. Every exists now only as information, as a pattern of words and images that replicates itself through time, adapting and changing as it goes, but never quite disappearing. The pattern is imperfect. We have lost so much, and what we have kept is fragmentary and contradictory. But it is enough to reconstruct something, to bring the man back, if only as a ghost, if only for the duration of a tale. He would not have understood this, and he would not have cared. He was a practical man, concerned with practical things, gold and silver, wind and water, the set of the sails and the weight of the cargo. The idea that he would be remembered, that his story would be told 300 years after his death, that people who never knew him and never could have known him would spend hours reconstructing his deeds and debating his fate, all of this would have seemed to him absurd if it had seemed like anything at all. He wanted to be forgotten. That was the whole point of his disappearance, the whole purpose of his vanishing act. He wanted to slip out of history, to shed his name and his past, to become no one in particular, just another old man in a world full of old men, invisible, anonymous, safe. In this, and in this alone, he failed. The name he tried to shed has outlived empires. The story he tried to escape has followed him down through the centuries. The gold he stole has long since been spent and respent 1,000 times over, absorbed back into the general circulation of wealth, but the tale of how he took it remains as vivid now as it was the year it happened, maybe more vivid, because time has worn away the complications and left only the essential shape, the fast ship, the waiting captain, the great treasure ship appearing on the horizon, the battle, the plunder, the escape, and then the mystery, the long silence, the unanswered question that keeps the story alive. He is still out there somewhere, in a sense, sailing the warm, dark waters that exist now only in imagination. The sea he crossed has not changed, though everything else has. The stars he navigated by are the same stars that shine tonight over the Arabian Sea. The winds that filled his sails still blow, following the same patterns they have followed for 10,000 years. And somewhere in all of that constancy, in all of that indifferent persistence, the ghost of the Fancy still runs before the wind, her hull trimmed light, her gun ports open, her captain standing silent on the quarterdeck with his eyes fixed on the horizon where the great prize is about to appear. He is still watching. He is still waiting. He has been waiting now for more than 300 years, and he will go on waiting for as long as anyone remembers the story, which may be forever, or may be only until the last person who cares forgets to pass it on. History is fragile that way. It depends on the living to keep the dead alive, to carry their names forward, to tell their stories to those who will come after. Henry. Every understood this in his way. He understood that the only way to truly escape was to be forgotten, and he tried his best to arrange it. But the story was too good, the heist too spectacular, the mystery too tantalizing. The world refused to forget him, and so he is trapped now in the amber of legend, preserved forever at the moment of his greatest triumph, unable to die, unable to rest, unable to finally disappear. The morning of September 7th, 1695, comes around once a year, every year, in the warm waters between India and the Horn of Africa. The sun rises over the Arabian Sea, and the light falls on the waves, and somewhere out there, in the space between history and imagination, a fast ship is still waiting in the haze for the sails of the richest fleet on earth. The sails appear. The captain gives the order. The fancy begins to move. And Henry Every, the quiet sailor from Devon, reaches out one more time for the treasure of emperors, knowing that this time, like every time, he will take it. Knowing that this time, like every time, he will escape. Knowing that this time, like every time, he will vanish into the silence that is the only true freedom, the only real victory, the only ending that matters. The sea keeps his secret still.